Chapter 471. Pull one hair and the whole body will be affected. After the white-clothed monk won the debate at Mount Longhu, he and Zhao Danping were summoned to Tai and city by decree. Then the old abbot personally went down the mountain to Beimang to discuss Buddhism with the Qilanjinren of the Tao Te Dao sect. Su Fengyan's mind wandered thousands of miles after the initial heat. When he came back to his senses, his mind was as calm as still water. This made His Royal Highness worry about whether or not there was a big problem between his legs. He sighed inwardly and approached the girl who was at least 85 when he took the Chang flute from her hand. Seeing the 4 characters of Beimang, he frowned and asked, "Do you understand the language of the southern dynasties?" The girl's voice was as soft as a mosquito's. "I understand, but I can't speak it well." The language of Beimang was originally complicated and varied. After the empress took over the dynasty, it gradually changed. However, the northern and southern dynasties were still distinct. Every time the empress went on a hunting tour, she would discuss matters with her close officials. Occasionally they would talk about things. Of course, the powerful officials of the northern royal court would mock and ridicule the officials of the southern dynasties. The people of the northern dynasties who were born in the imperial tent were inevitably filled with a sense of superiority. After the end of the Spring and Autumn War, the Central Plains was stabilized. The empress took over Beimang as a young monarch and usurped the throne. Then she took the opportunity to settle the remnants of the Spring and Autumn War. This caused Beimang to be in turmoil. The Liang dynasty and the Liang dynasty fought 6 times. The Liang dynasty won 2 times in name, but the true meaning of victory was only 1 time. It was when the empress took the opportunity to unify the Spring and Autumn War and took the opportunity to take the initiative to attack Beimang's unstable foundation. They won on 3 fronts and fought all the way to the capital of the southern dynasties. Unfortunately, they couldn't finish the war in one battle and continued their northern expedition, leaving Beimang with a chance to breathe. People only said that Su Shao, the king of Beiliang, was greedy for power and didn't want to destroy Beimang. As a result, he had no soldiers to lead, so he withdrew his troops. In reality, both sides were preparing to sign an alliance. Only Su Shao didn't hesitate to use his head as a guarantee and privately went to the emperor. He said that as long as the emperor gave him a secret edict, he could only lead the Beiliang army and enter the north alone. Even if he had to sacrifice 200,000 soldiers, he would make Beimang lose its title. At the time, the old Grand Secretary stood by the monarch's side and only laughed coldly. The next day, Su Shao was the first to withdraw his troops back to Beiliang to express the Liang dynasty's sincerity. This could be considered Su Zhao's second time being a scapegoat after the Spring and Autumn War and his rise to the Jianghu. Many old soldiers who had been through hundreds of battles silently withdrew from the Beiliang army at this time. In the 5 battles between the 2 countries, the Liang dynasty lost more than they won. The 4th time was the most crushing defeat, almost exhausting all of the elite border troops the previous emperor had accumulated. The eastern front north of Great Peace City was cleared of the wilderness, and it was even more forbidden to raise troops and attack without permission. It was only now that General Gu Jiantang had resigned from his post as the Minister of War and was personally overseeing the 2 Liao provinces, in addition to the Grand Secretary Zhang Julu's support, which was said by the scholars to have spent half of the dynasty's wealth, that the declining situation took a slight turn for the better. Su Fengyan directly asked, "Who are your parents?" She shook her head and said, "I am an orphan, adopted by the clan when I was young." Su Fengyan was most familiar with the dirty tricks of the imperial family. He asked with a smile, "Have you never thought that you might be a golden branch or jade leaf with the surname Yelu or Murong?" The young girl's eyes widened and her mouth dropped open. Clearly she had never thought about this matter. Su Fengyan inadvertently saw the pink tongue behind her white teeth and felt hot again. However, he didn't feel the least bit ashamed of his inferiority in front of a beauty. He only lowered his eyebrows slightly and glanced down at his waist, silently praising, "Good brother, you are very capable. After working hard to cultivate the Great Yellow Courtyard, there shouldn't be any irreversible side effects. Otherwise, His Royal Highness would really use a piece of tofu to knock himself to death." Without any worries, Su Fengyan was in a good mood and threw some of the troublesome problems to the back of his mind. He remembered that in the past he had spent a lot of money to buy countless poems. When they reached his second sister, only one line, "Tomorrow worries will come tomorrow worries," entered her eyes and made His Royal Highness so happy that he had the servant send another 700 taels of silver to that poor scholar, 100 taels per word. Later, he heard that this scholar had passed the imperial examination and had some fame in the capital. He was one of the few honest people who didn't want to wallow in the mire and curse His Royal Highness with the scholars. It was probably because of this that he had waited on the cold bench for several years before he was replaced by a county clerk in a barren mountain and turbulent river. Su Fengnian sat by the lake and beckoned her to sit down. Smelling the unique fragrance of a woman, His Royal Highness, who hadn't even seen a female mosquito after leaving Flying Fox City, felt as if a lifetime had passed. The wild bulls were vast and mighty. Su Fengnian was wholeheartedly studying the swimming fish style in the knife manual. How could he care about distinguishing between male and female? Besides, even if he could distinguish between the two, what else could he do? Su Fengnian wasn't even afraid of the devil Xie Ling, but this thought scared him so much that he trembled. He then held his belly and laughed. It could be said that he found joy in the bitter struggle of Beimeng alone. After laughing, he saw that the young girl who was sitting upright and still was confused. No matter how thick-skinned Su Fengnian was, he wouldn't be so brazen as to mention this. He lowered his head and stroked the Chang flute. The two dark purple bamboo pipes were side by side with gold and silver threads intertwined. The holes of the pipes were smooth and round. Even after many years of playing and stroking, there wasn't the slightest bit of wear and tear. It could be seen that it was a precious Chang flute of top quality. Su Fengnian could be considered an expert in calligraphy. He carefully observed the four main characters written by Murong in front and Yelu in the back. The characters carved on the Chang flute were extraordinary. He didn't exchange the flute. Instead, he smiled and said, "Take good care of this keepsake. Who knows, maybe one day you'll be the shepherd girl Mu Ko Shinbei's head. If that day really comes, remember my kindness." The girl blushed when she saw how gentle and meticulous he was stroking her, making her even more charming. However, when she saw this young master from the southern court using her beloved Chang flute to stroke her back in such a careless manner, there was a hint of resentment in her eyes. Perhaps Su Fengnian was slow to realize it, or perhaps he was deliberately teasing her, but when he saw her face, he couldn't help but smile. He extended a finger and twirled the Chang flute's opening, grinning wickedly. The girl's face was thin and she was about to cry. Su Fengnian returned the Chang flute to her and lay down on the grass. He was afraid that there wouldn't be many days of such leisure and carefree days in the future. The girl sitting cross-legged beside Su Fengnian clutched the Chang flute and lowered her head, saying, "I'm sorry." This time she really was crying. Su Fengnian knew that she was apologizing for her cowardice after being saved in the canyon. The corner of his mouth curled up and he said in a calm tone, "It's not wrong for a girl to be timid. If you feel that it's wrong, you can be bolder and sit on me. Even if I suffer such humiliation, I won't resist." Su Fengnian was originally teasing the girl and he was just teasing her. He didn't think that this girl would really use up all her courage and boldness in her life to sit on his waist. His Royal Highness, who had been suppressed, sucked in a breath of cold air and said sanctimoniously, "Girl, please have some self-respect." Chapter 3, Around 3 in the morning. Not included in tomorrow's update. Chapter 472. An ignorant girl straddled the man's waist and sat with her butt raised. You couldn't expect her to be good at horsemanship in this aspect. Su Fengnian, on the other hand, was very familiar with it. Just a moment ago, he was like a chaste woman who was awe-inspiring and righteous, asking the girl to respect herself. However, when he saw her taking the initiative, he immediately changed his attitude and started to undress himself without hesitation. Having illicit sexual intercourse in the wild, having a banquet in heaven and earth, and wantonly humiliating the northern Mang woman. It should be the dream of many weak northern Liang gentry children. Su Fengnian had seen many of these poor rich scholars who thought that they could compete with the soldiers who led troops to kill the enemy by riding on the northern Mang prostitute's body in the brothel. Su Fengnian's eyes were clear as he looked at the herdsman who seemed to be crying and laughing at the same time. He stopped what he was doing, which was mostly acting. She undoubtedly had a pair of bright eyes, which were not the kind that directly pointed at one's heart, but the kind that was pure and untainted by dust and dirt. This kind of woman's eyes were destined to be like the clear lake on the grassland beside him, which would disappear into the yellow sand sooner or later. Once he saw her this year, he might not see her again next year. Even if she was a golden branch and jade leaf left behind in the grassland, even if she returned to the palace, what benefit would it bring? Su Fengnian did not have the charming thought of taking off his clothes to see her naked, but he was not allowed to take advantage of her. He smiled and shook his head, indicating for her to relax. At the same time, he held her extremely flexible and slender waist with both hands in an inappropriate position. The two of them looked at each other. The so-called killing a beauty with a sword under the waist was probably the true portrayal of Su Fengnian at this moment. No matter how innocent and naive the girl was, she matured early. No matter how ignorant she was not a fool. She also knew what kind of evil was suppressed under her soft buttocks. Riding a horse and herding sheep would not be so embarrassing. This was not a woman who deliberately wanted to seduce people. Even though Su Fengnian had been untainted by flowers for a long time, he also felt that those fallen monarchs who never went to the morning court were not wronged. Su Fengnian's hands quietly slid down and naturally squeezed. This was a skill that came with practice. Back then, during the 3 years of traveling, he had relied on this ingenious technique to make that brat Wenhua prostrate himself in admiration. Unfortunately, this brat's comprehension ability was worlds apart from His Highness the Crown Prince's, and he could not maintain a righteous expression as a moral person. Unfortunately, he had a lecherous face that deserved a beating. Every time he mustered up the courage to go to the downtown area to take advantage of women, Su Fengnian would inevitably have to step in to save the situation. If Wenhua cooperated, saliva would immediately flow from the corner of his mouth, and then he would say that he was an idiot brother in the family. Girls with weak temperaments would be soft-hearted and let him off, but those who were more shrewish would be punched and kicked, implicating Su Fengnian as a fish in the moat. Among the latter, Xianyuan Qingfeng was the most relentless, leading his vicious servants to chase after them for several streets. The young girl did not say anything and only stared at him with her eyes wide open. In his life, other than a girl's crying, Su Fengnian could not stand this kind of pure gaze. He could only withdraw his hands in embarrassment and laugh as he scolded, "You're the only one who's allowed to ride a horse, but I'm not allowed to flatter you?" The young girl, who was not used to puns, thought carefully. When she had figured out the meaning, she clumsily revealed a slightly late bashfulness. Su Fengnian saw her charmingly naive appearance and could not bear to do it. He sat up and held her in his arms, lightly smelling the fragrance of her fine black hair and feeling the delicate trembling of her virgin body. He sighed and slowly released her. Beimang's customs were bold and unrestrained. Not only were there illegal activities permitted by the law, but there was also the custom of kidnapping a bride, as well as the remarriage of a woman whose sister had passed away and whose mother had become a widow's sister-in-law. These were all excellent reasons for the scholars of the Central Plains to criticize the barbarians of Beimang. Su Fengnian picked her up and put her down beside him. Heng Chunlei sat on his lap and stared at the lake, lost in thought. A 16-year-old beauty's body was so soft that it was as if a hero had entered the grave. Perhaps if it were any other man who had suffered internal injuries from holding himself back, he would have already taken advantage of her reluctance and enjoyed the pleasure of having sex with her. After he had eaten his fill, he would not recognize her and would touch his crotch to laugh at the common people. However, His Royal Highness, who had begun to feel melancholy again, turned his head and laughed. "If only you were Pei Nan Wei or Yu Yu Wei." There was no woman in the world who liked to be compared with other women. Although the girl was ignorant about love, she could still hear the weight of the words. She did not dare to show her grievance and only turned her head away. Su Fengnian stood up and made a plan in his mind. He wanted to see if he could help this group of fleeing herdsmen settle down. If he had the chance to return safely in the future, he would take her back to Bailiang Palace. Not to mention whether she would be a vase or eaten, it would be good for the eyes. Later on, when he evaluated the top 10 beauties and spent some money, she would definitely be on the list. If word got out, it would be a happy thing to make those scholars envious. If he ate her now, would he take her to the north? If he ate her but did not take her back, Su Fengnian did not want to hear that she had become the exclusive property of some vigilant person in his tent. His Royal Highness, who had been taken advantage of by Shu Xiu countless times, had also learned some superficial disguising techniques. The finished product could only be considered a shoddy product, but it could still be considered a cover-up. However, was she willing? The herdsmen of the tribe could not reveal the secret? Especially some young and strong men who had left their homes and harbored resentment. They might even use a few bags of silver to win the favor of Xian Shirley for the sake of wealth and future. The human heart was unpredictable. Even if he had saved the entire tribe, Su Fengnian did not feel that he could sit back and relax. He did not want them to be his puppet. Su Fengnian thought about it and decided to stay in this ill-fated herdsman's tribe for a few days. He asked, "What is your name?" She said softly, "Huyen Guanyin." Su Fengnian knew that many people in Beimang respected and believed in Buddhism. Many people liked to use Bodhisattva, Maitreya, and Manjushri as their names. It was not rare or strange. If it was in the spring and autumn period in the Central Plains, the name was too big and would be regarded as ominous. However, in Beimang it was very common to use such names as small characters. Even the women's clothing was deeply affected. In the winter, they painted their faces with yellow material, which appeared golden. It was called Buddhist makeup, which could only be washed away in the warm spring. When the emissaries of the Liang dynasty first saw the women in Beimang, most of their faces were yellow. They thought it was because of the illness caused by the miasma. Chapter 473. Su Fengyan asked her to take it to the tribal camp. Huyan was a first-class family name on the grasslands, similar to the Tuoba family, second only to the Yelu and Murong royal families. It was bestowed by the Mang lord who was well versed in the culture of the Central Plains 100 years ago. Presumably, this tribe's city was a descendant of the Huyan family. However, the family name was prestigious, but it didn't mean that anyone with the surname Huyan was a noble. Beimang had a strict hierarchy, not inferior to the Liang dynasty at all. People were divided into 4 classes. Originally, there were only 2 classes, the native of Beimang and the remnant of the spring and autumn period. They were fiercely opposed and had countless disputes. The chess and sword music school's Taiping order proposed to divide the people into 2 classes, both below the remnant of the spring and autumn period. In fact, they were all sinners or stubborn people who were forcibly brought into Beimang territory by force. Their numbers were relatively small, but even so, the remnant of the spring and autumn period were all grateful. It was their nature not to worry about scarcity but to worry about inequality. Not only that, but they had also become a person above others. Of course, the people were divided into 4 classes. The small group of nobles who stood at the top of each class, regardless of wealth or status, were far beyond the reach of ordinary people. Su Fengyan muttered to himself, Tuoba Huyan Guanyin, these names are quite interesting. Are there Yelu Methreya and Murong Puxian? She said softly, yes. Su Fengyan rolled his eyes and flicked his finger on her forehead. You don't know how to read people's expressions at all. With your blockhead, even if you really went to the imperial tent in the imperial city, you wouldn't be able to become a princess with 100,000 thoughts. She raised her voice slightly, perhaps this was the biggest protest in the world. I'm not. Su Fengyan pinched her chin and teased, you say you're not? Then if I say I'm the emperor of Beimang, then I'm the emperor of Beimang? She blushed and retorted seriously, Her Majesty is a woman. Su Fengyan sighed and no longer reasoned with her. When he went to the herdsman's tribe with her, he was worshipped as a god. Su Fengyan went up and down in the canyon like an immortal, saving more than 20 people, and then he stopped the herd of cows. With the help of a Buddha-like old monk, everyone, regardless of age, knelt on the ground devoutly. The old patriarch even shed tears as if the grievances of migrating thousands of miles had been swept away. Beimang's people were simple and honest, unlike the famous people of the Liang dynasty who believed in Huang Lao in prosperous times and escaped to Buddhism in troubled times. Anyway, they did whatever they could to protect themselves. In the tribe, only Huyan Guanyin knew the language of the southern dynasties, so she passed the message. When they found out that the young bodhisattva was going to stay in the tribe for a few days, they were all very happy. The young children and girls were even more excited. Besides Huyan Guanyin, there were also a few girls who were rescued by Su Fengyan and hoped that the handsome bodhisattva who was not like a herdsman could stay in their yurt. The grassland household registration was based on a yurt. When Beimang was first established as the emperor's palace was just a yurt. Even the previous emperor had to stay with his confidants and close officials every time he went hunting. Therefore, the Liang dynasty secretly criticized that when the empress of Beimang was still the empress, she had an affair with several powerful officials while the emperor was sleeping soundly. This really surprised the people of the Central Plains who lived in the imperial palace. The tribe leader was called Huyan Anbao. He personally welcomed Su Fengyan into the spacious black and white yurt. Other than the simple and honest son and daughter-in-law, the old man also had a granddaughter and a granddaughter. The granddaughter was once brought up the mountain by Su Fengyan and was extremely happy. The grandson was the child who was always held by Huyan Guanyin at the bottom of the canyon. He stared at Su Fengyan's eyes as if he was looking at a deity, full of reverence and worship. When Su Fengyan entered the yurt, the child and his sister stood outside the yurt together and looked at the young deity's elegant demeanor through the gap. They only felt that every movement of the young deity was extremely beautiful. They reckoned that when Su Fengyan burped and farted, the 2 siblings would think that it was a great knowledge. Beimang revered martial arts and was good at horseback archery. They especially revered powerful martial artists who had outstanding strength and strong fists. Tuoba stepped on the bones of his fellow tribesmen to become the empress's servant. Revenge had never changed in Beimang for thousands of years. The Dangxiang tribe especially focused on revenge. If they didn't take revenge, they would inevitably be disheveled and dirty. They wouldn't get close to women and wouldn't eat meat. Only after killing their enemies could they return to normal. After both sides reconciled, they would need to fill the skull wine cup with human blood and the blood of 3 animals. Both sides swore that if they took revenge they would take the lives of 6 animals. When Tuoba gradually became the god of war and had outstanding military achievements, the 16 tribes of the Dangxiang tribe were convinced. They proposed to the number 1 person in Beimang to reconcile. Tuoba ignored them and the leaders of the 16 tribes committed suicide together. Later on, when the empress appeared, Tuoba only agreed verbally. Not only did the Dangxiang tribe not see it as a great shame, they even took it as an honor. Without exception, the valiant and strong young men joined Tuoba's personal army. It could be seen that Beimang had a strong spirit of martial arts. Sitting in the tent, after listening to Huyen Guanin's narration, they found out that her tribe's migration wasn't done blindly. Huyen Anbao's father, who died on the way, was a staunch believer in evil spirits. He was a well-known fortune-teller who was good at using wormwood to burn sheep's scapula. Back then it was this old man who took in the baby girl in swaddling clothes. At the end of winter, it was this old fortune-teller who used the cursed sheep to request the tribe to migrate to the southeast. Su Fengyin was skeptical of this kind of fortune-telling witchcraft. When he heard it, he didn't take it to heart. When he found out that Huyen Guanin lived in the adjacent tent, he glanced at her. It was just a small gesture out of habit, but it made the young girl blush like a peach blossom. The old tribal leader saw it but didn't say anything. He just smiled and felt gratified. The little girl was alone and had no one to rely on. In the end, she still needed to marry a man with broad shoulders to truly settle down. The old man had complete faith in this young Master Su who claimed to be from Gusai Prefecture. At the bottom of a narrow valley, a man could stop 10,000 bulls. It was a miracle that he didn't even dare to think about. The old man still remembered the legend of 9 swords breaking 10,000 cavalry that had been circulating in the grassland for 100 years. Although it was a magnificent feat of the Wu family swordsmen from the Central Plains, he felt that the young bodhisattva sitting in the same tent was comparable to those 9 swordsmen. After Su Fengyin drank a big bowl of wine and ate big chunks of meat, he walked out of the tent with his head lowered. Huyen Guanin followed behind him. Su Fengyin slowly walked up a small hill. Other than the young girl, there was also the old tribal leader's grandson sneakily following from afar. He seemed to be called Abaoji by his nickname. Su Fengyin looked at the setting sun and suddenly narrowed his eyes. A yellow eagle that was originally hovering leisurely cried incessantly. It swept across the sky and swayed as it fell. 100 miles to the northeast, the yellow eagle fell to the ground. There was a small bird's claw that was like an iron hook that was nailed into the eagle's back. It was only heard of the eagle catching the sparrow. Was there really a sparrow riding an eagle in this world? The extraordinarily handsome bird flew to the shoulder of a young man who had a sword and a saber hanging from the left side of his waist. Its cry was crisp and clear. The young man in the fox fur hat had 2 retainers standing beside him. One of them was a middle-aged man with a strong body like a lion. His voice was as loud as a bell. "Young master, you've already killed no less than 600 people and 4,000 wild bulls on your way here. Have you enjoyed yourself?" The other old man in a brocade robe said gloomily, "Of the 10 great devils, other than you and I who are both slaves to the young master, I haven't seen any of the other 8. How can I enjoy myself?" The young man sneered with a strong smell of blood. He reached out to tease the small bird on his shoulder and said, "Devils and whatnot are actually boring to kill. Killing that Buddhist saint is more interesting." The self-proclaimed Beimang demonic old man nodded and said, "This dragon tree monk of the 2 Zen temples is said to be the master of the white-robed monk Li Xiaoxin. We should meet him." Hearing the name Li Xiaoxin, the young man's eyes turned red. He reached out to gently hold the small bird and suddenly exerted force. His hand was covered in blood. He gritted his teeth and said, "They all deserve to die." Chapter 474. The young master in the fox fur hat casually tossed away the falcon-hunting sparrow. He rubbed his thumb and fingers together. The blood was thick and he sniffed it. Obviously he had a shrewd and ruthless personality. He wiped his fingers on the fox fur coat. The middle-aged man said, "Even though the old bald donkey Long Shu is a saint, he is from the 3 sections. His realm is too fake and can't be accurate. There are more than 30 people in the martial arts role of the dynasty who are first-class 4 states. I reckon only these people can enter the young master's eyes. Even though the Vajra state is divided into big and small and the Buddha's invincible golden body is respected, it is still the ability to take a beating. When it comes to killing people, I'm afraid even compared to the Confucian and Taoist sects, not to mention me and my brother who are from the demonic sections. This bald donkey from the 2 Zen temples is the most suitable for the young master to practice his knife. He can hack 800 and 1,000 times in one go to verify if the Buddha is really invincible. The elder in the brocade robe sneered, Duan Bo Air, are you really stupid or are you pretending to be stupid? A saint is a saint. How can his golden body be broken so easily? Be careful that you don't get to eat the lamb. You and I know each other well. Besides, no matter how good the young master's talent is, he is not 20 yet. He still can't enter the Vajra state after fighting with the bulls. Can the 3 of us gain anything by intercepting and killing Longshu Monk? The man sneered, what's so difficult about that? It is a secret that the old bald donkey entered our dynasty. We can let the young master find a few great guardians and gather 1 or 2,000 cavalrymen. We can use the wheel war to kill the old bald donkey. When the time comes, the young master will chop off his head and be the only person who can kill a land immortal. Who would dare not to submit? The elder said in disdain, if the saint wants to leave and avoid the battle, even if he has 1 or 2,000 cavalrymen, can he catch up? The middle-aged man crossed his fingers and his joints cracked. He laughed sinisterly, the old bald donkey eats vegetarian food and chants to Buddha. When the time comes, we will threaten him with the lives of a few hundred herdsmen. If he dares to escape, we will kill 1 for each step. Let's see how far he can run. Hundreds of people died because of his cowardice. If this news spreads out, the old bald donkey Longshu is no more than a holy monk. How can he still have the face to talk about Dharma with our imperial preceptor, Immortal Qilin? The old man in the brocade robe with the surname Tuoba had a feminine aura like a water snake, which made people feel uncomfortable just by looking at him. The middle-aged man with a sturdy physique looked more righteous, but the latter was more flattering, which suited his identity as an evil servant. The young master raised his hand to prevent the embroidered robed retainer from blurting out sarcastic words. He removed a pitch-black metal tablet from his waist and instructed, go back, go to the nearby tents and pass on my order. Gather 1,200 cavalry in 3 days. When the time comes, we will meet at Yellow Eagle Valley and intercept the Dragon Tree Monk together. If anyone dares to disobey, I'll allow you to act first and report later. I don't believe there's an eagle on the prairie that isn't afraid of my Tuoba family. Duan Bo Air acknowledged the order and left. In the Beimeng dynasty, other than the royal family and the young master's family, there was no other branch that could make 2 of the 10 great devils willingly become their servants. This time, he left home because of his father's unwillingness to let him lead an army to the border of Gusai state alone. His father was clearly an invincible martial artist who relied on his glorious military exploits to reach the top of the royal court, but he actually valued his elder brother who read the classics of the Central Plains so highly. He favored one and discriminated against the other, which really annoyed him. However, although he didn't like his elder brother's actions, their brotherhood had never faded. Especially in these years when he caused countless troubles, it was always his kind-hearted elder brother who came forward to settle everything. He didn't hesitate to become enemies with many of the Yelu Murong children. He was very grateful for this, especially when that foxy sister-in-law took the initiative to seduce him at the beginning of the year. Even his father was furious and wanted to cripple his martial arts without listening to his explanation. It was still his elder brother who calmed his father's anger. After that, the brothers had a heart-to-heart talk and pulled the woman who was nominally his sister-in-law to him. He laughed and said that he was sick and would sooner or later die because of him. Looking at his elder brother's gentleness and the woman's shame, even with his father's innate ruthlessness and cold-bloodedness, he couldn't help but feel moved. He remembered that when he was young, before his father's military exploits, the 2 brothers relied on each other for survival. Indeed, the elder brother was like a father and never let him be bullied by the tribe. This proud son of the prairie and desert muttered, as long as you don't live past 40 years old and don't fight with me, I will always see you as my elder brother. The demon in brocade robe turned a deaf ear to the young master's heart-wrenching words. The young man touched the hilt of his knife and asked, who is the recent Shinti? The old man smiled and replied, it's Chucha, from the Huiwa tribe. He is in charge of 20 to 30,000 people. His tribe members are good at hunting leopards and lions. Chucha, was originally a small official in the eagle catching room. He was only promoted to Shinti after offering a few good eagles as tribute to the Huiwa tribe leaders. I heard that the women in the tribe are very beautiful. The young master said indifferently, then go to Chucha and rest. As for the women, you can choose as you like. The demon in brocade robe got along with this extremely noble young man. He was far from being as servile as the middle-aged man. He laughed and said, "I know that the young master has high standards and doesn't care for these vulgar things. It would be impolite for me to refuse." The young man dismissed it with a smile. To him there were only a few women in Beimang. For example, the national pipa player of the current dynasty who was known for her slender hands and excellent drumming skills, the princess who was rumored to have an affair with Chen Jibao of Bailiang, the princess of the Murong family of the Golden Toad State who liked to keep male companions, and a woman who was a zither player among the top 10 demons. Other than these, there were not many women who could arouse his interest. He suddenly asked, "I heard that the 10th demon, Xialing, is dead?" Chapter 475. The old man said calmly, "Xialing fought Luo Yang when he was at his peak. Luckily he didn't die, but he should have been seriously injured. I guess it's not strange for him to be killed when he fell from Shenji to Jingang. The top 10 list of diabolism is not like the martial list. It's based on fame and cannot convince the public. The top 3 were still alright, but when the old servant and Duan Bo heir returned, the remaining 7 were a mess. For example, the Dragon King beside Princess Hong Yen was only ranked 9th, but he had a 60% chance of winning against the 5th-ranked female zither player. At the end of the day, in the path of martial arts, the best way to kill and break one's hand was to break through from the second stage to the first stage step by step, and then use the Vajra finger mysterious celestial phenomenon to reach the Earth Immortal realm. There were a few youngsters who appeared to be extraordinarily talented, yet they were immediately astonished by their brilliance, and were rumored to have extraordinary achievements in the future. However, in this old servant's opinion, they were not even worth mentioning. Therefore, even though Hong Jingyan was fierce, his future achievements would most likely be far inferior to Luo Yang, the number 1 figure of the Devil Path. This old servant has surveyed the Jianghu of the northern Mang and Liang dynasties. In the past 100 years, there were only 5 such figures. Dragon and Tiger, Qi Shenju, and Wu Dang's Hong Shixiang could be considered the same person. The last 4 people are all very careful. Little master, don't think that Yelu Dongchuang and Murong Shuilong are at a higher level than you. You are the only one who has the chance to be on the same level as the other 5. I'm looking forward to it, so I don't want to die." Ah. The demon in the brocade robe laughed eerily, like an evil spirit walking in the night. The young man stretched and said slowly, "After hearing what you said, I want to kill again." The sun was setting in the west. In the herdsman's camp, the sun was setting. The heat was fading away and the wind was blowing. It was peaceful and peaceful. The herdsmen of the grassland mainly ate meat and dairy products. The meat came from cows, horses, and alpacas that died naturally, as well as wolves, foxes, deer, and rabbits that were hunted. If the cows or horses died, they would be cut into strips and hung under the sun to dry in a ventilated place. Their internal organs would be made into sausages and eaten raw. Freshly slaughtered mutton was a rare feast. Thin slices of mutton were soaked in salt water and sliced with a sharp knife. Su Fengyin was squatting at the side, watching how the herdsmen milked the horses. The method was peculiar. First, they nailed 2 wooden stakes into the ground, then pulled up a long rope and tied the mare to the young horse for a period of time. The mare would gradually run to the young horse's side. It was unusually quiet, and the milking process was much smoother. If the horse's milk was fresh, it would be very sweet and not inferior to cow's milk. Su Fengyin watched as Huyan Guanyin and the granddaughter of the old patriarch milked the horses skillfully. After the milk was poured into the large leather pouch, it was handed over to the young men in the tribe to stir and beat. It was said that after the horse's milk was fermented, the residue at the bottom of the leather pouch would be used to feed the livestock slaves. The pure part on top would be enjoyed by the superior herdsmen in the tribe. Some of the best horses' milk would even be offered as a tribute to Shirdi. Su Fengyin squatted beside a child named Abaoji. He did not speak but just followed this immortal bodhisattva in his heart from afar. No matter how he looked at it, he would never get tired of it. Su Fengyin suppressed his hot and dry emotions. Looking in this direction, he could just see the details of Huyan Guanin's milking. He clicked his tongue and said, "Her technique is really not bad." During the official dinner that followed, the patriarch Huyan Anbao not only served a whole roasted lamb to this living bodhisattva who was the benefactor of the entire tribe, he also took out his precious collection of tiger bone wine and yellow rice wine. The staple food was a meticulously brewed soup made from barley and mutton. This was almost all of the tribe's wealth. Su Fengyin wolfed down the food and especially did not refuse anyone who offered him a toast. This made the dozen or so forthright herdsmen who represented their respective camps to have a better impression of him. Most of them drank to their heart's content and were dead drunk. The old patriarch was no exception. On the contrary, Su Fengyin had the cultivation of the Great Yellow Court and the disposition of a large volume of alcohol. After the banquet ended, he walked out of the tent that was filled with the smell of wine and meat. The herdsmen were more in awe of this young man with profound martial arts than they were close to him, so they did not dare to disturb him. Su Fengyin came to the lakeside to raise the Huangtong sword embryo. After the flying sword entered his sleeve, he saw Huyin Guanyin leading the evasive Ah Baoji over. The young girl gathered her courage and said, "Ah Baoji wishes to be your disciple and learn martial arts from you." Su Fengyin shook his head and said, "That's impossible." Although the child did not understand the language of the southern dynasties, he could still clearly see the bodhisattva shaking his head. The young girl hesitated for a moment and said softly, "I beg you to teach him one or two fist techniques. Any fist technique will do." Su Fengyin laughed and said, "Am I very close to you? Do I owe you money?" Huyen Guanyin bit her lips, her gaze desolate. Su Fengyin ignored her. He broke off a leaf of watergrass and flicked it with his finger, tearing open the surface of the lake. However, it did not move forward in a straight line. Instead, it twisted and slithered like a fish snake. Ah Baoji was dumbfounded. This was much more powerful than the martial arts masters in his clan. This was not Su Fengyin's intention to show off in front of them. It was just a casual move. On the 6th page of the knife manual, the opening shoe style seemed to be wide and wide, but it was actually complicated and obscure. On the 7th page, the swimming fish style was still a skillful move. Compared to the sword chi rolling dragon wall, it lacked sharpness but was more rounded. On the latest page, the 8th page, was called the black hair knot. It was like a mass of tangles. Su Fengyin did not know where to start. Since he had nothing to do, he could only entertain himself and treat it as practice makes perfect. He kept breaking off leaves and tearing open the surface of the lake. The rich in martial arts and the poor in literature. Apart from the family background, martial arts ultimately required hard work and unremitting practice. This was also the biggest obstacle. Otherwise, the rich aristocratic families who were richer than the nobles did not lack secret manuals, weapons, and expensive medicines to strengthen the body. Logically speaking, they should have produced many masters. However, in fact, the majority were still powerful martial artists who came from ordinary families. Whether it was Li Chenggang or Old Huang, they all came from the poor streets. This was probably the root of why the martial arts world was far more lively than the literary world. Other than the fair ranking of the 10 people in the Beimang martial arts roll, what was more attractive was that all the martial arts masters in the 2 dynasties and 2 Jianghu who had reached the first Pin realm were captured in one fell swoop. There were a total of 32 people. Even if there were some left out, it was still an unprecedented feat. Su Fengyin knew that among the first Pin masters in the Beimang martial arts roll, there were several young martial arts masters of similar age. Among them, Yelu Dongbed and Murong Longshui were both members of the royal family. The former was a military upstart in the palace tent and was in harmony with Dongjua. The latter was a woman, but unfortunately she was as fat as a pig and looked worrisome. On the Beiliang side, Chen Zhibao and Yuan Zuozong were both on the roll. The former was even regarded as the new generation of spear immortal. Su Fengyin narrowed his eyes and thought of the situation where the Tsing Yi almost killed the White Yi. Then he thought of her dimples. The next chapter is before 12 o'clock. The 3rd chapter is estimated to be around 4 o'clock in the morning. Chapter 476. A burst of light footsteps broke the tranquility of the lakeside. Abaoji's sister trotted over and whispered something to Huyin Guanyin. Su Fengyin, who had studied the Mang language, knew that the Yu were about to give birth, and Huyin Guanyin should be an expert in delivering lambs. They went to the sheep pen together and quietly watched her deliver the lambs in an orderly manner. After the job was done, she stroked a lock of hair on her temples and smiled. Because of the migration, most of the sheep in the tribe were thin and weak. It was not easy for them to survive the harsh winter. Therefore, delivering lambs became the most important thing after they set up camp. Abaoji, who was strong, could not hold himself back. He chased around the sheep pen and finally, like a hungry tiger pouncing on a sheep, he caught a small lamb, grabbed it by its hind legs, stood up, picked it up, and danced around wildly. He was so domineering that even Su Fengyin was stunned. The little guy's sister reprimanded him with her hands on her hips. If she could not reason with him, she would pull his ear. After the little guy let go, the sister went to catch another lamb. During the process, she was kicked countless times and was covered in mud and dung. It was not until Huyin Guanyin, who was free, gently persuaded her that she let go of the poor lambs in the pen. Abaoji was unwilling to take a bath. Even Huyin Guanyin could not persuade him otherwise. Su Fengyin grabbed the naughty little brat by the collar and threw him into the water when they reached the lakeside. The little brat was not angry. He just swam in the lake happily. For the next 2 days, Su Fengnian coldly observed the tedious work of this small tribe. Regardless of whether they were male or female, old or young, their division of labor was clear. They were not allowed to be lazy. Herding livestock, milking cows, digging wells, shearing fur, tanning leather, gathering dung and weaving hemp. As long as they had enough strength, they would never be able to finish their work. Su Fengnian did not interfere and only silently calculated the land cost of a herdsman or a control flux warrior. After conversing with Huyen Guanyin, he learned that in the previous generation, there had been a few members of the Beimang Imperial Court's Cheshui army who had been exempted from many miscellaneous taxes. Otherwise, with the tribe's manpower and resources, they would have to hunt large wild animals or even raid other tribes to survive. However, these two matters were too risky. If they were not careful, the tribe would be annihilated. Every day there would be small tribes of this scale in the prairie that declined or were annexed by other tribes. They migrated here and luckily managed to occupy a piece of the lake. They could only hope that the local government would be lenient and that the neighboring tribes were weak. During this time, Su Fengnian had a secret discussion with the old chief. After that, Huyen Guanyin finally put on a rough face, which broadened the horizons of the herdsmen of the tribe. They increasingly viewed Su Fengnian as a strange character who had reincarnated from a bodhisattva. On the 3rd day at noon, Su Fengnian, who was meditating by the lakeside, looked toward the north. They had finally arrived. However, compared to what he had expected, this time it was much larger. The owner of this pasture, Titi Chucha, was sitting high on a tall horse. This Titi Chucha was in the prime of his life. He had a robust body and was dressed in wolf-skin clothing. The hair near his ears and in front of his forehead was shaved, and 2 braids were tied behind his ears. A large falcon was perched on his shoulder. Chucha waved his hand, and 100 or so riders behind him rushed out with strange cries. They galloped wildly around the campsite. This was not considered a terrifying method. What was more frightening was that there were 2 cages beside Chucha. Each of the cages held a golden cheetah and a fierce tiger captured from the Tu Liao's side. The 2 fierce beasts that were originally curled up and dozing seemed to have smelled the scent of blood. They suddenly stood up in their cages and roared. Their sharp claws slammed against the iron bars as if they were about to devour someone. The chief, Huyen Anbao, who had migrated thousands of miles away, led the members of the tribe and gathered together in fear. They did not bring any weapons and did not dare to show any signs of resistance. Migrating across the border was originally a wrong thing to do. If it was not for the fact that the tribe did not have any valuable treasures, Huyen Anbao would have personally gone to offer incense to this new Titi Chucha, who would control the life and death of the entire tribe in the future. Su Fengnian and Huyen Guanyin did not walk out of the tent. There was still an indignant Abaoji hiding beside them. He looked at the arrogant Titi Chucha's personal guard through the gap, but in the end, his gaze stopped at the man who looked like a master and servant beside Titi Chucha. The young man was wearing a fox fur hat and had a sword at his waist. Unlike the knights, he sat cross-legged on the back of a horse and looked at them with a cold expression. The old man in the brocade robe had restrained his spirit. Although Su Fengnian had restrained his prying gaze at the first moment, perhaps because Huyen Guanyin had revealed some clues, the old man felt that something was amiss. He looked straight at them with a cold gaze. The cavalrymen narrowed the encirclement, completely not giving Huyen Anbao a chance to get close to Titi Chucha. Every autumn, when the empress personally came to the Beimang Palace for a large-scale hunt, it was the same. However, it was even more spectacular. Just chasing the prey from the periphery required tens of thousands of soldiers and took 2 months. The soldiers were orderly and advanced slowly. The Imperial Cheshui army was in charge of supervising the troops. The formation followed the established route strictly. If there was a slight deviation, they would be dragged away and beaten. If the prey escaped the encirclement during this period, the decurion would be beheaded on the spot, the centurion would be stripped of his official position, and the chiliarch would be demoted by 1 rank. When the hunting circle finally narrowed to a distance of 2 to 3 square meters between the soldiers, ropes were tied together and blankets were covered. At this time there were countless wild beasts in the circle. Lions and donkeys were in the same place, cows and horses collided with each other, and jackals, wolves, foxes and rabbits were squeezed together. What followed next was a feast of slaughter where the rank of nobility would decrease in order to enter. Chucha gently shook her shoulders, and the great falcon flapped its wings and flew into the sky. Then this Titi Chucha smiled cruelly and clapped her hands. When the cavalrymen opened a gap in the hunting circle, a few spiky beast slaves who were not fully clothed immediately opened the cage and let out the restless howling tigers and leopards. Releasing the reins, the wild and untamed leopard and tiger rushed out side by side and skillfully pounced on the herdsmen in the circle. When the tigers and leopards ran, their slender, dynamic and strong bodies were especially prominent. This meant that once they came into contact with the herdsmen, it would be an incomparably bloody tearing. The distance of 100 steps was covered in an instant. Chapter 477. The two strong herdsmen guarding the tribal leader had participated in many wild beast hunts. Although they did not have spears and arrows, they still stood out of the formation. They first took big steps and then ran wildly to confront the lions and tigers that came out of the cages. The tigers and leopards that he had carefully raised were not ordinary prey. Their wildness was far stronger than when they were first caught. Only when they went out to hunt, they were imprisoned in cages. The rest of the time they were kept in cages. When they killed all the livestock, when they changed cages, when they punished the shepherds who violated the rules in the tribe, they were thrown into cages. Even those horned experts with amazing strength could not withstand a few rounds of killing and biting of the tigers and leopards. For many years only one person survived, and after that one of his arms was bitten off. Almost at the same time, two herdsmen were pounced on by the agile tigers and leopards. Their necks were bitten and their intestines were cut open. The two beasts lowered their heads and gnawed at each other. When the limbs of the herdsmen stopped twitching, the tigers and leopards raised their heads at the same time and looked at the frightened herdsmen in the cages. Inside the tent, Abaoji saw the tragic situation and his face was full of tears. He was about to rush out and fight for his life when Su Fengyan held his head and threw him back into the tent. He then lifted the cotton blanket that was used as a curtain and rushed out. Su Fengyan did not expect this shirdi to be so ruthless. Generally speaking, although herdsmen who crossed the border could be sentenced to death, it was true that human lives were worthless in the grassland and desert. However, it was different from Beimang's attention to the number of young men who could control horses and fight in the tribe. The grassland women's remarriage was more relaxed than the Central Plains people's etiquette, justice, integrity and shame. Every time there was a war, Beimang would spare no effort to abduct the people at the border of Liang dynasty to settle in the north. It was all because in the final analysis, the strength of the big and small shirdi was measured by the number of horses and heads. Generally speaking, when a tribe raised a flag to betray the tribe and chose to migrate, as long as the tribe had enough strength and was not afraid to be the enemy of the previous shirdi, most of them would be willing to accept them. Huiyan Guanin's tribe was thousands of miles away and the original shirdi was destined to be out of reach. For any shirdi who did not lack water and grass, it was a fortune. It was nothing more than spending some money to bribe the superior official who was in charge of the nomadic household registration. It was equivalent to having more than 30 more tent tax sources. Su Fengyan did not expect that the shirdi who came after hearing the news and met with the herdsmen would want to use blood to establish their power. The handsome young man with the sword and saber at his waist raised his eyebrows. The old man in the brocade robe was about to speak when the young man shook his chin, indicating that there was no need to pay attention to him. Su Fengyan tiptoed and jumped over the cavalry's head. When he landed, he happened to be in front of the old patriarch. The fierce tiger opened its bloody mouth. Su Fengyan did not care about the tiger's claws that were blocked by the big yellow court mirage. He grabbed the upper and lower jaws of the tiger with both hands and gently tore it in half. He threw it in front of him. Splitting tigers and leopards was nothing more than this. The only remaining leopard suddenly stopped. It was obvious that it felt a huge sense of danger and did not dare to rush forward rashly. Chucha was furious and snorted coldly. The beast tamers and slaves began to shout and command the leopard to kill. The leopard with shiny fur finally could not hold back its restlessness. It rushed in a straight line and turned when it was 10 steps away. It jumped 5 steps to the side and pounced to the right side of the prey. Su Fengyan had comprehended the river-splitting technique from the canyon. He did not move his hands nor did he use his saber, but the prey's body was cut in half in the air. This time it was Chu Cha and the cavalry's turn to be dumbfounded. The eyes of the young man in the fox fur coat brightened and the corner of his mouth twitched. It was really a surprise. The reason why the Shirtai led the troops to kill this tribe of 100 was because of the instructions of the powerful young master Tuoba. On the grasslands, perhaps there were powerful Shirtai who did not give face to the Yelu and Murong descendants, but there was absolutely no one who dared to disobey his orders. In the desert, his father's words were almost equivalent to Her Majesty's imperial edict. If it was in the Beimang army it would be even better. The key was that the Empress had never felt that her merit was too high. She did not have the slightest suspicion of this military god who came from the Dongxiang tribe and trusted him to the utmost. Therefore, in the northern palace, even if you were a relative of the emperor or a prince, when you met the two sons of the military god, you would have to lower your head. This young man called Young Tuoba had personally killed 600 people along the way. When did any of the Shirtai go to the Empress and say anything? There was no lack of Shirtai who personally led the horses and sent him out of the border. Young Tuoba was still holding his chin. He tilted his head and smiled. Which state of the southern dynasties are you from? Why don't you be my adopted son? You will be able to enjoy glory, splendor and wealth in this lifetime. Beimeng had the custom of accepting adopted sons. It was similar to the Liang dynasty's adopted sons, but their status was usually only slightly higher than that of a servant. Of course, the adopted sons of powerful families could also bully men and seize women by flaunting the might of the emperor. Especially those big families in the Beimeng palace who could wear Xinbei jade belts, the adopted sons had prominent power and countless privileges. The young man smiled and casually said, I know that you lowly people have some useless backbone. If you don't agree after killing all these shepherds, I'll make you my first target. I'll bury you in the yellow sand, peel off your scalp and water you with mercury. Su Fengyin didn't want to talk nonsense with him. He just said calmly, speak properly. The young man sitting cross-legged on the horse was stunned for a moment before he burst into laughter. He raised his hand to wipe away the tears from his eyes as he stared at the man with the saber in the hunting circle. Instead, he asked the brocade-robed devil beside him, when will he arrive? The old man's eyes were shining. He laughed and said, in 15 minutes. It's rare for a delicious food to come to your door. Young master, are you not going to personally take action this time? The young man curled his lips and said, I'm in a good mood today. I'm still considering whether to accept him as my adopted son or peel his skin and expose him to the sun. The old man stepped out of the line and asked, then I will play with him for a while? Young Tuoba, who didn't feel that there were many people in Beimeng that he was afraid of, nodded lightly. Su Fengyin's Huangting palace was like a flood. His figure flashed like a rainbow and pressed one hand on the forehead of the young man with the wolf hat. He pushed the young man off the horse and slid on the ground for a distance of 15 meters. Chapter 478. When Su Fengyin pressed down on the cross-legged young man wearing the fox fur coat on the horse with one hand, he was determined to blow up the head in an instant. However, the master and servant had underestimated Su Fengyin, who was traveling the grasslands. He also did not expect this rich child to have such a strong internal energy. Although it seemed that he was thrown off the horse and even thrown 50 or 60 feet away, in fact, his palm was bounced away as soon as it touched the young man's forehead. The brocade-robed old man left the horse's back and attacked Su Fengyin's head with both palms. Su Fengyin was not willing to do such a shady business of exchanging a life for a life. He could only watch helplessly as the great opportunity to capture the ringleader slipped from his hands. After throwing off the young man wearing the fox fur coat, he quickly moved to the side and pulled away from the brocade-robed retainer. The young man sitting on the ground had his wolf hat slanted. He grinned, revealing a mouthful of white teeth. He gently reached out to touch his burning forehead. He didn't hurry to get up and clicked his tongue in wonder. His body's chi flowed like dragons and snakes, concealing a profound principle. It wasn't wrong that Su Fengyin couldn't kill him in one strike. The Tuoba family dominated Beimeng by tempering the body. Their foundation of martial arts was incomparably firm. This young man was brought by his father to the ice plains in the extreme north when he was young. He dug a hole to hide his chi and slept in ice all year round. Compared to the Taoist method of returning to the original from the inside out, he did the opposite and went from the outside to the inside. Could be said that the first rank had 4 realms. Among them, the diamond finger mysterious celestial phenomenon. Every time Tuoba stepped into a realm, he could be said to be the number 1 in Beimeng. Like father, like son. This young man who claimed to be number 2 in Beimeng was also equally outstanding. Otherwise he wouldn't have been called Little Tuoba. Fortunately, he was able to control his impatience and didn't pull out his sword. After getting up, he patted his back and for the first time, raised his hand to signal the devil in brocade to not be calculative. He laughed and said, not bad, not bad. With your technique you're not far from the first rank. If you still have strength left, it'll be amazing. Whether it's scheming or ability, you've opened my eyes. When did such a talented person appear in the Southern Dynasty? Which Jia clan's direct descendant are you? Tell me. I can't bear to skin you. Just treat it as a joke. Don't mind it. After the Empress of Beimeng came to the court, she exchanged and listened to the suggestions of the powerful officials in the north and south. According to the system of the Central Plains, she came up with a rough division of families. Apart from the 2 royal families which were the first-class surnames, there were 10 families named A, which were known as the surnames Fufu and Zhuoran. The three families in the southern dynasty were all ancient and powerful families in the aristocratic group in Longguan. These three families were the leaders who controlled the government of the southern dynasty. Little Tuoba, who was wearing a wolf hat and fox fur coat, naturally thought that this hidden figure of the southern dynasty was a direct descendant of the three great clans. Including the 32 people of the first class from the two dynasties, there were 18 people on the list of Beimang. This was enough to make the Liang dynasty, which boasted of its outstanding people, blush with shame. Fortunately, Wang Xinji and Dong Tai occupied two of the top three positions, which saved a lot of face. Apart from his father, the four gods and demons Hong Jingyan, Luo Yang, and Murong Baoding, as well as the state preceptor, Immortal Qilin, the five great clans of Mount Tibing Chess and Sword Music School had 6 positions. Apart from Luo Yang, whose position overlapped with Xialing's, and the dead Xialing, 5 of the 8 notorious diabolism giants were on the list. Together with the 2 rising stars, Yelu Dongchuang and Murong Longshui, there were 18 people in total. The 6 celestial disciples of Immortal Qilin of the Tao sect were all at the bottleneck of the first class. Taoist Jinren often reached the first class and were only 1 step away from the first class. Little Tuoba couldn't help but be curious about the man in front of him. He was only a few years older than him and was able to cross the threshold of the second class at such a young age. The second class was called the Master Realm. It wasn't like cabbages that could be planted in autumn and harvested in winter. His father once said that there were too many geniuses in the Liang dynasty who had the potential to reach the top. The current situation where Beimang had the upper hand might not last long. Su Fengyan smiled. It's just a small family, not worth mentioning. The young man in the fox fur coat nodded regretfully. He jumped up and gave little Tuoba a taste of his own medicine. He suddenly pulled out his blade and chopped down. The blade was no different from a normal cavalry. However, when it was in his hand it was shocking. The old man in the brocade robe had his hands in his sleeves. He looked like he was watching the battle with squinted eyes. However, his footsteps were light as little Tuoba attacked. Su Fengyan took a few steps back. His left palm slapped on the handle of the spring thunder blade. He swung the blade backwards and drew an arc. After barely dodging the blade, he flicked his finger and the spring thunder turned around and left the battlefield. Almost instantly, Su Fengyan's body leaned back and dodged the second blade. Little Tuoba also dodged the spring thunder that was behind him. He took a few steps forward and the third blade was raised. Su Fengyan's body returned to a standing position. He flicked his finger and the spring thunder continued to spin around. The scabbard and the blade clashed together. The young man in the fox fur coat laughed evilly. He held the blade with one hand and changed it to 2. His strength increased explosively. He was used to seeing experts fight since he was young. Naturally, he had the ability to see things from a strategic perspective. He wanted to cut off this weird blade's chi pattern so that this fellow couldn't continue to act mysterious. Just when he was confident that he could cut off the chi pattern, Su Fengyan moved forward. He didn't care about the spring thunder blade. He passed by him and pushed his palm towards the young man's forehead. The young man in the fox fur coat didn't fight according to common sense. His hands didn't change the trajectory of the blade nor did he reduce his strength. Instead of dodging, he swung his head forward. Su Fengyan's face was expressionless. He didn't touch the young man's forehead with his palm. Instead, he touched the young man's face. He raised his wrist and held the young man's chin. His arm and sleeve were filled with chi. He suddenly pushed his arm and sleeve upwards. The young man who was still holding the blade with both hands fell down. Su Fengyan raised his leg and kicked towards the young man's chest. The young man in the fox fur coat shrunk his chest and removed most of the force. He still slid far away after landing on the ground. The blade in his hands cut a crack on the ground. Chapter 479. Blood seeped out of the corner of his mouth. He lifted his sleeve and wiped it away. Little Tuoba grinned coldly. Just now, he wanted to take the full force of the kick and deliver a heavy blow to his opponent. But after years of training by his father, he was keenly aware that if he really did that, both sides would suffer. Damn it, even if one leg was broken he would have to pay an unbearable price of breaking his chest. He had no choice but to put away his saber and point it at the damn guy's crotch. If he dared to ignore the consequences he would cut off his family jewels. He made the right bet but he still suffered a great loss. It was equivalent to taking a kick for nothing. His chi and blood were surging, which he had not enjoyed for a long time. With the brocade-robed servant on the side, the young machete man who did not draw his saber did not chase after him. Little Tuoba spat out a mouthful of blood and slowly stood up. He asked, "You are so fearless. Could it be that you have entered the first class?" Su Fengnian held the spring thunder that was not as satisfying as before. He had no time to care about the wonderful expressions of terror and the hundreds of cavalrymen. At the critical moment of life and death, he had to deal with both the young villain and the old man in brocade robed. He could not take the time to enjoy the surprise and awe in other people's eyes. As for the life and death of the herdsman, he had to survive first before he had the right to think about it. Little Tuoba's manner changed completely. He no longer smiled. "I don't want to play with you anymore." Su Fengnian gave him one back this time. The young man in the fox fur hat did not get angry. He calmed down and changed the saber in his right hand to his left hand. After drawing his saber, there was still a good sword hanging on the right side of his waist. As a right-handed person, he was obviously ready to draw his sword at any time. Restraining his frivolity, the young man really brought a lot of surprise to Su Fengnian. After fighting seriously, the saber in his left hand was better than in his right hand. The strong wind penetrated the blade. After a few flicks, the wind brought up sand and stones, which almost pierced the mirage and reached the skin. Su Fengnian frowned and had to loosen part of his chi. He used the spring thunder as a sword. The sword aura rolled on the dragon wall. This move was secretly learned by the chess and sword music school and became a famous move. It was magnificent. Su Fengnian's body was like a fish. Although the spring thunder was out of his hand, he still controlled it. Su Fengnian's body avoided the sharp edge of the young man's saber, but the sword aura kept on increasing. It was the same move of Su Fengnian. Every time it passed, the sword aura grew bigger and bigger. It was like a snowball rolling. After 10 rounds of sword aura rolling on the dragon wall, Tao Qianji was crushed. At this moment, the young man's sword was rolling on the dragon wall countless times. Although the young man showed signs of defeat, he was always separated by a layer of window paper. Just when little Tuoba thought that he had grasped the trick, the swimming fish style that Su Fengnian learned from the herd of wild bulls no longer retreated. Instead, he slid in front of little Tuoba. He flicked away the spring thunder with one finger and grabbed the back of the saber with his left hand. When he was about to make a move, he could clearly see that the young man who was less than 20 years old was shocked. However, Su Fengnian did not beat him when he was down. Instead, he retreated without hesitation. As expected, little Tuoba, who was as good at acting as he was in martial arts, finally pulled out the famous Beimang sword and drew a ruthless crescent moon on Su Fengnian's chest. Su Fengnian exhaled quietly. His body gently touched the ground and floated backward. The ground suddenly exploded. It was really like a sudden clap of thunder rising from the ground. A giant python with a colorful crown on its head rushed out of the ground and bit at Su Fengnian's right foot that had landed on the ground. The old man in the brocade robe did not make a move. It was actually this beast that had sneaked out of the ground that launched the sneak attack. Su Fengnian did not follow his instinct to jump up and expose the flaws of the young man in the fox fur coat and the retainer in the brocade robe. Instead, he stomped down on the giant python's mouth that was full of sharp teeth. The sharp teeth cut through the mirage and slid down 2 bloody grooves on both sides of Su Fengnian's calf. At the same time, Su Fengnian took advantage of the opportunity to stomp the head back into the ground. Su Fengnian succeeded in stomping down, suppressing the intense pain and numbness on his calf. However, when he looked at the old man in the brocade robe who had taken a step forward and then retreated, his red phoenix eyes narrowed. Finally, he did not conceal his killing intent. He knew who this sinister old man was. He was the colorful python brocade sleeve man, ranked 7th among the 10 great devils of Beimang. This person was abandoned in the wilderness when he was young and no one knew what he was raised by. It was unknown whether he was gifted or not, but he could understand the language of beasts since he was young. When he left the mountain when he was young, he became famous for rearing rare birds and strange beasts. However, when he was in his prime, he did not know the immensity of heaven and earth and wanted to steal a young Qilin from the forbidden area of the Dao sect. His spine was shattered by the state preceptor of Beimang's finger, causing him to lose all his skills. However, he was still able to make a comeback and enter the Vajra realm. In terms of martial arts prospects, it was impossible for him to advance to the mysterious finger realm. However, because he reared so many ferocious beasts, he almost did not need to personally fight against his enemies. It was impossible for his enemies to guard against him when he controlled the ferocious beasts. This was especially so when a female python with a colorful crown on her head was about to transform into a dragon. For some reason, she died before she could soar into the clouds. He cut open her abdomen and dug out her 3 eggs. The 3 young pythons were fed countless elixirs and hundreds of kinds of flesh and blood. After 20 years of unnatural maturation, their bodies were only slightly smaller than the adult female pythons. The old man in the brocade robe laughed softly and said, "The outcome has been decided." Little Tuoba glanced at Su Fengyan's calf that was bitten by the colorful python's teeth. He slowly sheathed his famed sword that could cut off hair and became cynical again. He said with regret, "What a pity. Even if a Vajra realm expert was bitten, he might be able to survive, but he would quickly become a puppet that could not move within a few hours. It seems like your luck is not too good. You still have to be buried in the sand, skinned, and poured water on your head. Fortunately, your whole body is paralyzed and you don't know the pain of being poured mercury on your head." Su Fengyan asked, "Since this old bastard is the colorful python brocade master, then you must be the youngest son of Tuoba, right?" Little Tuoba waved his Mang saber and nodded. "Tuoba Chun's son." Su Fengyan replied indifferently again and continued, "Spring bamboo shoots? They are not as delicious as winter bamboo shoots." Tuoba Chun's son held his stomach and laughed out loud. He was in a good mood. He quite liked this kind of unfunny joke. When he heard it before he killed someone, it was just like when he had lost his appetite and came across a plate of good food that looked, smelled, and tasted good. It was the best way to eat. However, in the next moment he couldn't laugh anymore. Chapter 480. The rainbow-crowned python was a rare and ferocious creature. Not only was its skin invulnerable to weapons, it also had the strength of a dragon and elephant. Who knew how many martial artists had died under its coiling body? However, Su Fengyan didn't know that the rainbow python's sharp teeth were so venomous that even a Vajra physique would lose consciousness. There were pros and cons to each step. At this moment, little Tuoba and the demon in brocade sleeves were confident in their victory. Su Fengyan, who had been concealing his chi activity all this time, didn't hesitate to open the golden chamber and charge straight towards the demon in brocade sleeves. He looked like he was going to destroy both jade and common stone. Little Tuoba was unperturbed and didn't have the slightest intention of making a move. On the other hand, the demon in brocade sleeves' pupils contracted. The soil beneath his feet exploded and the rainbow python broke out of the ground once again. The demon in brocade sleeves stood tall on the head of the rainbow python that was as large as a millstone. Looking down from above, the demon in brocade sleeves' chi activity boiled all over his body as he prepared to use the rainbow python's strength to block the final blow from this descendant of the Southern Dynasty. After taking 5 steps, Su Fengyan suddenly stopped and staggered. The demon in brocade sleeves relaxed and sneered. The rainbow python had swallowed countless poisons, and the miasma it spat out could make an ordinary person faint and die. Even if you were a Vajra realm expert, if you were cut by its sharp teeth and the poison seeped into your meridians, the more you circulated your chi activity, the deeper the poison would go into your acupoints and bones. Su Fengyan only paused for a moment, which should have been an obvious sign of exhaustion. The old man in brocade robes relaxed a little at the same time. Little Tuoba, who had superb acting skills, shouted a warning for no reason. The colorful python-embroidered sleeves saw the man with the saber slide to the front of the colorful python in the blink of an eye like a fish. Taking advantage of the blind spot under the colorful python head-raising lamp, he made an unknown turn and then disappeared without a trace. The devil, who was not good at hand-to-hand combat, knew that the situation was not good. Su Fengyan, who had been twisting and turning in the narrow space among the herd of wild oxen, appeared behind the devil in brocade robes out of thin air and was about to slap the old bastard's back with his palm. This steel-crushing style was taken from a secret manual in the Tide Listening Pavilion's martial library. It had the aura of subduing dragons and tigers. When he practiced the saber on Mount Wudong, the secret manuals and ancient manuals he brought to the mountain were mostly sword and saber moves. Later, when he rushed to Beimang because he needed to cultivate his will, he made a last-minute effort to learn from others' strong points. He no longer restricted himself to sabers and swords, picking up some of the best moves from the 18 types of martial arts. With this steel-crushing hand, no matter how thick and heavy the steel was, it would be shattered inch by inch. After Su Fengyan landed firmly on the ground, he grinned sinisterly. He wasn't flustered and exasperated. He was just a little regretful that he wasn't able to strike to his heart's content. He didn't look at the old devil who had almost smashed the python's head off. Instead, he looked at the man who was as strong as a lion and tiger. Using the great yellow quartz ability to perceive the heaven and earth, he didn't detect the man's concealment beforehand. He could only do the same thing as when he pressed his hand on Tuoba Chunsen's forehead and give up a great opportunity to inflict serious injuries. If it was a one-on-one battle, Su Fengyan was completely confident that he could win by slowly exhausting Xieling. But now, Tuoba and the other two were cooperating skillfully and formed a triangle with each other. He felt a little bit trapped in a death situation. Although the colorful python embroidered sleeve master who was at the Vajra realm wasn't seriously injured, he was still frightened and broke out in cold sweat. He turned around and said sternly, "Brat, you deserve to be hacked to death." Seeing that this valiant retainer who was far stronger than the old servant in embroidered robes had arrived in time, Tuoba Chunsun was relieved. He held his broadsword and clapped his hands leisurely as he praised, "Not bad, not bad. Your acting and killing skills are first-rate. Just now you were able to make me draw my sword in a one-on-two battle. I'm sure you still have some tricks up your sleeve. Why don't you take them all out?" Su Fengyan sneered, "If you want to pretend to be a big shot, you should at least beat me down first. Otherwise, what qualifications do you have to waste your saliva here? Interesting?" Tuoba Chunsun didn't get angry. Instead, he smiled and explained patiently, "Originally, I don't like to talk nonsense when I kill people. However, be it spring bamboo shoots or winter bamboo shoots, since there's a plate of delicious food in front of me, it's normal for a customer to praise the color, aroma, and taste before eating. This is also human nature. I'll say this first. When you're stuffed into the sand and scalped, I'll definitely talk more nonsense. If my saliva and mercury accidentally drips onto your head, please don't mind it." Su Fengyan smiled and asked, "Since there's an expert embroidered sleeve master who can't even defeat a finger of Qilin's spiritual master, may I ask who this big brother who is serving as a dog for the spring bamboo shoots is?" The burly man narrowed his eyes and gave a concise reply, "Duan Bo Er Hui. I'll tear off your limbs later." Su Fengyan only stretched out a hand with his palm facing up. Tuoba Chunsun twisted his neck and walked slowly towards Su Fengyan. He said with a smile, "Let me do it. It's not easy to find such an excellent saber dummy like you. I want to play with you slowly." Tuoba Chunsun then waved his hand and ordered the horsemen who were as dumb as ants, "Don't bother about these herdsmen. Go and open up the hunting circle. Guard the 4 directions in the north, south, east, and west. 25 horsemen will form a team. If this young master is lucky enough to escape from the circle, it doesn't matter if you use your warhorses to ram him or use your lives to fill the gap." Tsuch was really afraid that young Master Tuoba would ask him to lead the horsemen to engage in a suicidal battle. Since it was just a hunting trip, it wasn't a difficult task. Immediately, he led 100 horsemen and wandered 200 paces away. Tuoba Chunsun, the devil in embroidered robe, and Duan Bo Er all returned. They formed a tripartite formation and helped each other. They imperceptibly trapped this fish in the net and reduced the space for him to act. Tuoba Chunsun, who had the advantage of time and place, began to run faster. He dragged his saber with both hands and rushed towards Su Fengyan. The saber was constantly surrounded by purple threads, vaguely showing the demeanor of a grandmaster. Chapter 481. Tuoba Chunsun's bladesmanship was simple and plain. His bladesmanship was straightforward and there were few fancy techniques. The rhythm was clear and distinct. Obviously, it was born from the killing of battle formations. The treachery of this Baimang's heaven-titled aristocratic family's son lay in the fact that he was able to switch between one hand and both hands rapidly. Only when there was no fixed pattern or unsheathed sword would people be afraid of him. This was similar to Su Fengyan's sheathed spring thunder at his waist. However, Tuoba Chunsun's advantage was that he had the demon in brocade robe and Duan Bo Er backing him up. As long as he was not killed in one strike, he could focus on his bladesmanship without any scruples. On the other hand, Tuoba Chunsun's physique was almost unparalleled in the world. Tuoba Chunsun was in high spirits as he fought to his heart's content. His bladesmanship became more and more ferocious. It was obvious that he was using battle to nurture battle. All the elite soldiers in the world were trained this way. On the path of martial arts, there were countless people who took this path. However, ordinary martial artists did not have a terrifying family background like Tuoba Chunsun's. Once they failed miserably, they would be consigned to eternal damnation. Regardless of how bloody and cruel Tuoba Chunsun's methods were, the temperament he had tempered was in line with the martial arts of the pinnacle. Su Fengyan kept his blade sheathed but did not show any signs of pulling it out. He only swung his hands and fought barehanded with Tuoba Chunsun and his bladesmanship. Several times he was able to seize an inch of advantage. He imitated Miss Hehe and used his hand as a blade. One time he succeeded. Just as he was about to blast this Baimang general's chi to pieces with stacked thunder, he was suddenly knocked away by the colorful python. This time he was quick-witted. His left hand cleverly moved the spring thunder at his waist. The short blade circled around his body and bounced to the side of Tuoba Chunsun's waist. Then he was slapped on the face by Tuoba Chunsun, sending Tuoba Chunsun flying. Just as he was about to give chase and beat him while he was down, He was entangled by Duan Bo Air, who was proficient in close combat, allowing Tuoba Chun-sun to recover his momentum. Tuoba Chun-sun looked at the young man who was not at a disadvantage in close combat with Duan Bo Air. He took a deep breath and stabilized his breathing. He smiled and said, "Fun, fun, fun." Duan Bo Air was ranked 6th among the top 10 of Beimang's Devil Dao. He was different from the colorful python-embroidered sleeve man who relied on external forces and the female zither player who used music to bewitch him. He relied on his own vigorous combat strength and was known as the dragon spine and bare shoulders. He was the #1 expert in close combat in the prairie. He had broken countless experts who were at the level of a nation. He fought in close combat with great force and strength. His fist aura was like a thunderclap as he dodged and shifted. His moves were not inferior to Su Fengyin's swimming fish style. If it wasn't for the fact that Tuoba Chun-sun had a weapon to distance himself from such a troublesome person, it would be impossible to deal with him. Tuoba Chun-sun quietly adjusted his breathing and was not in a hurry to enter the battlefield to practice his saber. He was curious why this young man with a saber would rather engage in close combat with Duan Bo Air than draw his saber. With this person's mystical ability to control the saber away from his hand and the boundless sword aura that was like a surging river, it would be easier for him to draw his saber. When Tuoba Chun-sun saw this fellow and Duan Bo Air punching each other's chests and taking a few steps back, he confirmed that this person was indeed in the Vajra realm. He let out a mouthful of turbid air and waved his saber. He laughed heartily and said, "Although I don't know how your Vajra realm can suppress the python's poison temporarily, I don't believe that you can exhaust the three of us by taking turns." Although Duan Bo Air was forced back by a punch, his expression remained normal. He was a little surprised by this young man's inner strength and patience. He silently withdrew from the battlefield and left it for the young master to practice his saber. Su Fengyin stretched out his thumb and wiped away the trace of blood at the corner of his mouth. Tuoba Chun-sun was using him to practice his saber, but wasn't he also using these three people to temper his physique and chi dynamic? Back then, Li Chungang had 300 to 400 sleeves of green snakes, so how could he be beaten up for nothing? Su Fengyin didn't dare to say that he was invincible, but if he were to say that he would exhaust his great yellow court cultivation and stamina that had stepped into the Vajra realm in a short amount of time, it would be a fantasy story. Although Su Fengyin was in a sorry state, he still cherished this opportunity. He was happy to let Tuoba Chun-sun slowly play with him. However, his mouth didn't show any mercy. He laughed and said, "Fun? Back then I told your mother the same thing. When you have a wife in the future, I'll tell her the same thing." The devil in brocade robe opened his mouth slightly and was stunned by what he said. He was really reckless. Didn't he know that the young master's mother was the woman of the #1 person in Beimang? Duan Bo Air let out a sigh and was a little impressed by this young man's guts. He could still be so stubborn even when he was on the brink of death. Tuoba Chun-sun had an indifferent expression as he walked into the battlefield with his saber. However, his right hand was on the hilt of his sword as he said slowly, "Since you want to die, I'll satisfy you. Let me ask you one last question. Why is your Vajra realm different from my 2 retainers?" Su Fengyin responded with a sneer and raised his hand to shake Kunlun. Tuoba Chun-sun was ignored by this fellow time and time again. He was at a disadvantage and twitched his mouth. The old man in brocade robe and Duan Bo Air raised their voices at the same time. They knew that the young master's good temper was gone and that he was about to start the massacre. A colorful python leaped out of the ground 10 steps in front of Su Fengyin and pounced toward him. Behind him, a huge python with a huge body that created a ditch in the grassland slid toward his back. Su Fengyin didn't care about the colorful python's sneak attack. He raised his hands and pressed them down. Kunlun could be shaken, so why would he be afraid of an evil creature that wasn't even a dragon yet? The colorful python that was pouncing toward him was twisted by his hands and slammed into it with his shoulder. When it landed on the ground, it created a huge pit. The colorful python shook its head and was severely injured. Behind him, layers of rivers were broken. 5 to 6 blood grooves appeared on the colorful python's body that was 30 feet long. It bounced into the air and struggled to its heart's content. When it landed on the ground, it was on the verge of death. The old devil in brocade robe's eyes were cold. The attacks of his 2 beloved colorful pythons were blocked as expected. Seeing that Duan Bo Air had closed in on him in an instant, the old devil sneered in his heart. Su Fengyin's single breath shook Kunlun and River Severing 6, and this was already his limit. After being punched in the chest by Duan Bo Air, the chi leaked out and formed a mirage. It was originally floating and swaying, and could not be said to be invulnerable. However, it was also broken by this brawny man who was ranked 6th among the Devil Path in terms of martial prowess. Due to the fist aura, not only did Su Fengyan's hair not flutter backward, it was pulled forward in reverse. After being smashed by the fist aura, his feet could no longer take root, and his body floated backward. Tuoba Chunsun, who had been running all the way, pulled out his sword for the second time. Strands of purple chi appeared on the blade's edge, and in an instant, it was as thick as a finger. The sword chi was a level stronger than before, and the blade slashed out an oblique cross in the air. Su Fengyan raised his arms to block. His sleeves were cut open and fresh blood flowed out. Tuoba Chunsun didn't show mercy after gaining the upper hand. With the blade and sword in his hand, he was dazzling like a bouquet of flowers. When the two finally stood in the flying dust, Tuoba Chunsun knocked his blade and sword against each other, shaking off a few drops of scarlet blood. Su Fengyan's hair was disheveled. He had a purple mark between his eyebrows as if he had opened the heavenly eye. He reached out and grabbed a strand of hair that had been cut off along with his headscarf in the air. He tied it into a knot and tied it into a headscarf. Chapter 482. Regardless of Tuoba Chunsun's family background or his outstanding talent, he always had the conceit of wanting the world to revolve around him. He was used to seeing people bow down to him, but when he saw this scholar of the Southern Dynasty silently tying his hair, he still couldn't suppress his fear and a burst of unprecedented jealousy. Although Tuoba Chunsun had an extreme personality that was tyrannical and bloodthirsty, his brain wasn't bad. Otherwise he wouldn't have let Chucha or hunt in the periphery even though he had the upper hand. He was afraid that this fish would slip through the net and escape. At this moment, as he gritted his teeth, he took 2 steps back and gently put his sword and saber back into the sheath. He said coldly, "Duanbua Erwi, you must make this kid draw his saber." The demon in brocade robe knew that once Duanbua Erwi, who was good at close combat, went all out, there would be nothing for him to do. He walked to a colorful python pet and squatted down. He took out a porcelain bottle that contained several kinds of rare venomous insects and poured them all into the mouth of the giant python that was severely injured by Duanbua Erwi. He then turned to look at the youth with the saber. It had been a long time since he had seen someone with such hatred. Moreover, this fellow was so young. He was like an old man in his 60s lying on the bed who envied those vigorous young men. He couldn't bear to see the young geniuses who were far ahead in the martial Tao. This time, under his intentional or unintentional guidance, he had harmed a few young experts who should have had boundless prospects. Other than dying under Tuoba Chunsun's hands, some became food in the colorful python's stomachs. There were also some whose limbs were torn apart by Duanbua Erwi's brute strength. None of them were spared. Today this unfortunate youth who had become a hunting target would have an even more miserable ending. Since Duanbua Erwi was known as the dragon spine and bare arms, his limbs, knees and shoulders were all lethal weapons. Now that he had received the young master's order, he no longer concealed himself. This burly man originally had a leopard's head and round eyes. After he revealed his ferocious appearance, experts would know that his killing intent had been aroused. His hair was the tip of his blood, and his fingers were the tip of his tendons which could cut iron like mud. Duanbua Erwi's blood circulation and chi circulation had reached their peak. The domineering aura of a Vajra realm martial artist was on full display. Chi flowed from his tendons to his limbs. Every time he took a step the grass would sink. His punches had no pattern. Su Fengyan's Fata Morgana, which he had constructed using the yellow quart, was like a bronze mirror that had been smashed by an iron hammer. Although it rose layer by layer like tidewater, it was still shattered layer by layer. His arms were already injured by Tuoba Chunsun's saber and sword. As he blocked the attack, his long robe was dyed red with blood. Duanbua Erwi turned around with a sinister smile and shouted angrily. His fist moved in a straight line, rudely breaking up the young saberman's skillful hand, and then he took a big step forward and rammed his shoulder into the saberman. Su Fengyan pressed both of his hands on his shoulders. 4 taels to 1,000 jin, but he also diverted the force and did not lose the momentum. One person charged forward, the other slid backward. Dust rose from all directions. With every step Duanbua Erwi took, the ground trembled. Looking at the cold face in front of him, he used his shoulder to push his elbow, and his elbow to push his hand. The strength of the dragon and tiger penetrated his muscles and bones like iron hooks. He punched his chest and his internal energy poured out. With a bang the young man was blown away by the punch. His body did not fall back in a straight line, but after his feet left the ground he slid in a full half arc in the air before landing on the ground. His feet were like a dragonfly skimming the surface of the water, indescribably elegant. However, Duan Bo-er was proficient in martial arts and killing. How could he give the young man a chance to catch his breath and climb up the tower? Taking advantage of the slight stagnation caused by the force of the arc, he calculated the right place to land and rushed forward like a wild horse galloping through a ditch. When he got close, his feet sank into the mud. His majestic body twisted like a fully drawn bow, and then he swept out a whip kick. A series of vicious movements were completed in an instant. Since the young saberman could not reach the peak of Mount Kunlun, he might as well sink his chi into his dantian and reach the yellow springs. He did not escape or evade. His feet planted firmly on the ground, and he used an incomplete Kunlun shaking style to forcefully resist this kick. This time when they made contact, the chi of both sides were like firecrackers, and their momentum was as strong as thunder. Duan Bo-er turned back his whip kick, and his body spun in midair. The second whip kick was aimed at the young man's head. Tuoba Chun-sun, who had been sitting on top of the mountain and watching the tigers fight, clicked his tongue and laughed sarcastically. It really hurts. It hurts just by looking at it. The young man who was about to be whipped to death was expressionless. His body leaned backward and fell to the ground. He slapped his palm and his body spun rapidly like a spinning top. Duan Bo-er, whose whip kick missed, could retract freely. He retracted his whip kick and took a step forward like a plow. Then he kicked the young man's waist. After the kick hit, he did not pursue the young man. Tuoba Chun-sun and the old man in brocade frowned but did not say anything. Duan Bo-er, who had stopped moving, had blood flowing out of his leg. It seemed like his calf had been pierced by something. He reached out to touch his neck and it was also dripping with blood. If he had not been startled and sensed that something was wrong, with Duan Bo-er's strength, that kick would have been enough to break the young man's waist and spine. Chapter 483. Su Fengyin, who had slid sideways, slowly stood up and spat out a mouthful of blood. He did not expect that he would not be able to inflict a fatal wound on the demon. The sparkling and translucent swan and eye was suspended in front of him while the slender ame was hanging at the front of Duan Bo-er's neck when he was in a kicking posture. At this moment, the realm of sword control was not enough to surpass the speed of the blade. Other than having a large stance, there were no substantial benefits. However, it was more than enough to kill the guard at the Duckhead Green Inn. Unfortunately, Duan Bo-er's 5 senses were sharp and he managed to dodge the flying ame. However, his calf was hit. With his Vajra physique, Swan Ni's sword pierced through his calf and it was not a big deal. As for the distraction of controlling the sword, Su Fengyin, who had suffered a powerful kick, was heavily injured. Duan Bo-er touched the blood groove on his neck with his finger and sneered, "What a sinister method." The demon in brocade robe's face was gloomy. He had roughly guessed the truth. He thought that the word sinister was not enough to describe this young man's ability to prick people's wrists. He turned to look at his young master who no longer had a smile on his face. He rejoiced in his misfortune. The more the little fellow who had yet to draw his blade showed off his martial prowess, the more miserable his death would be. His young master's physique was single-handedly forged by Tuoba. His young master also lived up to the expectations of the Beimang army god. He looked around Beimang and his line of sight was fixed on the 18 people on the list. Following this, he could be considered to have no one in his eyes. This time he had suffered a setback in Dragon Waste Prefecture. With second young master Tuoba's vengeful personality, how could he not bear this grudge? Su Fengyin spat out turbid air and blood clots. He nodded and smiled, sinister is sinister. However, 2 masters who are sitting steadily in the Vajra realm and a descendant of a prestigious family who is only 1 step away from the Vajra realm. The 3 of them ganged up on him and killed him. It was very honorable. Duan Bo-er remained unmoved. All the bones in his body creaked. Tuoba Chun-sun, whose eyes were burning, said, "Where did you get the sword control technique from? Tell me before you die and I'll give you a quick death." Su Fengyin did not pay any attention to him at all. He just adjusted his breathing and recited the incantation. He meditated and nourished his Tao foundation, nourishing his chi, nourishing his spirit. The primordial yang did not leave to hide its true nature. The yellow court plant had the longevity lotus. 10,000 taels of gold would not be given to anyone. The beauty of the Taoism's great yellow court was not in harming others, but in nurturing longevity. What was longevity? Perhaps it was as illusory as the formless mirage, but the flow of chi was so fast that one would not know the mystery behind it unless they were in a life-or-death battle. Su Fengyin was secretly glad that he had practiced the Kai Shu style diligently. Under the destruction of the rolling dragon wall sword aura, the acupoints in his body seemed to have slowly opened up a blessed land, allowing him to freely choose the treasures. Although Su Fengnian only had 50 to 60% of the Great Yellow Courtyard, this cultivation base was really useful under the tempering of Li Chuangong's green sleeves snake sword aura. Otherwise, his body would have been badly damaged during the battle with Duan Boer. He would not have been able to withstand a few rounds of attacks from this devil. Tuoba Chunsun asked curiously, "You've even used this sword control technique that seems to be from the Wu family sword tomb. Other than puffing yourself up at your own cost, you haven't pulled out your blade. Do you have any other tricks up your sleeve?" Tuoba Chunsun probably knew that this cold-faced arrogant fellow would not answer. He answered his own question, "I know. You must have more than one sword control technique. How many more do you have? 2, 3, 4? Su Fengnian laughed, "I do have a few flying swords." Tuoba Chunsun laughed as well. Duanboer Hui, continue? Duanboer Hui obeyed the order to continue the fight. The momentum of his fist did not decrease, but he paid more attention to dealing with the treacherous flying sword. To Beimang, the earth-shattering 9 swords that broke 10,000 riders 200 years ago was deeply imprinted in the hearts of all martial artists. Therefore he did not dare to underestimate the swordsmen of the Wu family. The sword tomb had been quiet for 200 years. The Jianghu of the Liang dynasty was no longer afraid of the Wu family who used all the sword moves in the world. On the contrary, it was Beimang who still remembered it in his heart. It was indeed a great irony. Duanboer Hui was afraid of the elusive flying sword, so he had been carefully probing. Although he was distracted, it did not mean that his punches and kicks were not fierce enough. From the beginning to the end, he still had the advantage of suppressing his opponent with brute force. The black silk knot was like a woman's love, knotted with 1,000 threads. Su Fengnian did not understand the 7th page of the saber manual. Now that he had to try to understand it, he naturally could not understand it. When he fought with Duanboer Hui, he was just trying to make a Hail Mary effort. He hung the flying sword on the nodes of the black silk, not according to the saber manual's embryonic form, and constantly used it as a trap. Tuoba Chunsun watched patiently from the side and counted the number of flying swords. Excluding the first 2, there should be 4 more. He clicked his tongue and asked, Hey, there are already 6 swords. Have you emptied your treasury?" Su Fengnian said calmly, "Seems like there's no more left." Soon after, the 7th dawn dew appeared in the sky. Even the strong-willed Duanboer Hui, who was an ambitious and ruthless person of the demonic path, had the urge to curse. The dawn dew and the 6 flying swords formed a black silk knot. It was like a heavenly net that enveloped Duanboer Hui, greatly limiting the power of this demon. Tuoba Chunsun sneered, "Give me another one if you can." As soon as Su Fengnian said, "There's really no more left this time," he rewarded Duanboer Hui with a freshly made flying sword. Duanboer Hui was finally enraged. The flying swords left bloody wounds on this demonic path magnate's body. However, Su Fengnian was also punched and kicked several times. Every time he was hit, he would be like a kite with a broken string. When the 8th peach blossom sword appeared, Duanboer Hui, whose eyes were bloodshot from all the killing, punched the young man's chest. He ignored the wounds on his body and rushed forward, tearing apart the net. The kite seemed to be drifting. However, intentionally or otherwise, it borrowed the momentum and quickly drifted toward Tuoba Chunsun. Duanboer Hui shouted, "Young master, be careful." The old man in the brocade robe controlled a colorful python to crash into the young swordsman who refused to give up. Tuoba Chunsun's hands swiftly grabbed the hilt of his sword and saber. Su Fengnian's body rose a few feet in the air. He stepped on the colorful python's head and suddenly pointed. Unexpectedly, he did not assassinate Tuoba Chunsun. Instead, he turned toward the demon in the brocade robe. He headed north. The spring thunder finally exploded. "I have a saber." An incomparably resplendent stream of light swept across the sky. It was green with hints of purple. "Li Chungang has 2 sleeves, I have 1 sleeve. 1 sleeve of azure dragon." The stream of light swept past. The old man in the brocade robe slowly lowered his head. His body was cut in half at the waist. Chapter 484. The robe was cut in half at the waist. The robe was cut in half by the sleeve blade. It was the robe of a devil path magnate that had lived for 60 years. When the light swept out, Tuoba Chunsun squinted his eyes subconsciously, just like an ordinary person looking up at the sun. When this little Tuoba, who had been living a smooth life, opened his eyes, he only saw a corpse that had been cut in half at the waist, and the damned young man who had finally pulled out his saber. He did not know when the short saber had returned to its scabbard. With both hands on the hilt, he slowly straightened his back and turned around to face Tuoba Chunsun and Duanboer Hui. Tuoba Chunsun remained motionless like a mountain. He weighed the pros and cons in his heart. If he was the one facing that saber, he would not have been cut in half by the saber with his sword in hand, let alone killing Duan Boer Hui. This was probably the shrewdness of this young man with mixed martial arts. After he knocked him down from his horse, he knew that it would not work to capture the leader of the bandits. Therefore he set his eyes on Jin Xiulang, who was used to riding the colorful python to fight the enemy. Duanbua Erwi, who was ruthlessly plotted against, gritted his teeth and said, "Young master, this man's chest was injured by my last punch. His chi can no longer flow smoothly. He can't even ride his sword, let alone use his saber. Let me collect his corpse." Tuoba Chun's son rolled his eyes and said, "It's best if you can collect his corpse. Don't collect mine when the time comes." Duanbua Erwi was furious. This time he did not have time to flatter Tuoba Chun's son. After Su Fengnian separated from Li Chungang, he had been cultivating his will according to the sheepskin fur old man's experience in sword isolation. With the help of the divine energy brought by the purple seal golden chamber, the one-sleeve green snake evolved from the two-sleeve green snake finally unleashed an unimaginably fierce spirit. However, it almost exhausted all of his essence, chi and spirit. He pulled the bow to the fullest, almost breaking the bowstring. After the spring thunder returned to its scabbard, Su Fengnian could not help but tremble, especially his hands that were holding onto his blade. His body had suffered heavy injuries from the repeated battles with Duanbua Air. His last punch had even caused him to bleed from his 7 orifices. It was just that he had forcefully suppressed it a moment ago, but now it was slowly flowing out. His face was covered in blood. In fact, when he first met Tuoba Chun's son and the colorful python man in silk sleeves, Su Fengnian was not afraid to fight, nor did he want to run. Tuoba Chun's son wanted to use battle to nurture battle and use him as a blade dummy. How could he not have such thoughts? However, man proposes, God disposes. With the addition of Duan Bo Air, he sank deep into the mud, and it was difficult to escape. It was the first time that Su Fengnian heard about old godly swordsmanly nurturing the sword will. Since the sword could only be unsheathed when it was required to kill with one strike, otherwise the sword will would be damaged. Wouldn't that make him look like a bully? Should he use this sword when facing an opponent whose realm was higher than his? If it was not suitable for him to unsheath, how was it different from learning the dragon-slaying technique when there were no dragons in the world? However, Li Chungang kept him in suspense and did not give him an answer. He only said that he knew the 5 sacred mountains before going to the mountains. Su Fengnian entered the empty realm of the canyon again. At this moment, the spring thunder no longer rumbled. Su Fengnian slowly closed his eyes. Layers upon layers of jadeite, the sword will and the saber will were all the same. Within the sheath of the small world, the spring thunder was full of vitality. The spring thunder that came out of its body scattered across the heaven and earth. It was as if it was rushing to the sea and then back again. It even went against the current and climbed up steadily. The line between life and death brought about great enlightenment. This was a clarity that could not be brought about by reading thousands of secret manuals in the martial arts library. It was like seeing the light with one's own eyes. This was the so-called lowering one's head and climbing the mountain for 60 years. Only then did one know that there was a lamp on the summit of Mount Kunlun. Tuoba Chun's son did not dare to take the risk easily. A plan came to his mind. He looked at Chucher, who was as cheap as an ant in his eyes. He waved at the horsemen who were already scared out of their wits and said with a smile, "Go, distribute 20 sabers to the herdsmen. Tell them that if they want to live, they have to hack this young man to death. Whether they can hack him to death or not, as long as they raise their sabers, I, Tuoba Chun's son, promise to give them 1,000 taels of gold and 10,000 cows and sheep." Chucher's martial arts were mediocre. He only knew that the machete man was not to be trifled with. However, it was easy for him to crush a soft persimmon. He led the 20 horsemen forward and came to the herdsmen. He threw down the 20 sabers and said gloomily, "Did you hear clearly? Our Baimang god of war's young master said that as long as you raise your sabers at the thief who fled into our territory from the southern dynasty, you will be rewarded with 1,000 taels of gold, 10,000 cows and sheep. Moreover, I, the king eagle of this grassland, Chucha, also promise you that this lake and this pasture will be given to you, if you don't know what's good for you." Chucha did not dare to take the initiative. He quickly and carefully turned his head to look at Tuoba Chun's son. The latter made a gesture of cutting his throat with a saber. Chucha, who received the instruction, immediately changed his expression and said sternly, "It's death." Tuoba's youngest son? Hu Yinbao's heart was as dead as ashes. He saw a young herdsman moving to pick up the saber. He glared at him and said angrily, "How dare you?" Chapter 485. The herdsman only paused for a moment. When he saw his fellow tribesmen walking out of the formation, he no longer hesitated. He silently picked up the machetes with clear edges. The herdsmen's wives and children also turned their heads away, not wanting to see this scene. A Baoji rushed out of the tent and spread out his hands between the cavalry and the herdsmen with machetes. His young face was full of tears. The old chief closed his eyes and tears flowed down his face. One old and one young, two faces. In the moment of life and death they were of no help. Lian Guanyin ran to a Baoji and hugged him. He rolled to the side and avoided the furious char. As a shady, he was the unquestionable ruler of this grassland. His ferocity soared. Even if he, an eagle, was only a chicken in the eyes of the Tuoba family, he was not someone the herdsman could go against. He pulled out a long and forged machete and slashed down viciously. Lian Guanyin's arm was cut so deep that the bone could be seen. Su Fengyin opened his eyes and bent down. The spring thunder spun in his hand. His back was facing the herdsman with machetes. His state of mind was as calm as an ancient well. He had seen too many ugly people and was not surprised. Moreover, for the sake of the tribe and the lives of his loved ones, it was reasonable for him to raise his machete or refuse. He held the spring thunder in one hand and raised his arm with the other. Suddenly, the river behind him broke and a gully appeared. The herdsman's charging formation showed a timid commotion and stagnation. Looking from afar, they could only see dust flying. After all, it was not as shocking as seeing it with their own eyes. The reason why they raised their machetes was not only because they were afraid of the Tuoba family's reputation, but also because they were lucky that this young scholar had a bodhisattva's heart. However, after the grassland split, it seemed to draw a line between life and death. If they crossed it, they would also die. Thus, their lucky mentality was swept away and their courage weakened. Su Fengyin stared at Tuoba Chunsun. He stretched out his hand and smoothed out the creases on his chest that were soaked in blood. He smiled and said, "Without the colorful python man holding you back, it won't be easy to stop me again. Why don't you and I hunt each other?" Tuoba Chunsun let out a wild laugh, which made his handsome face twist a little. Pointing at Su Fengyin, he said, "There is a saying in the Central Plains that goes like this. An arrow at the end of its flight cannot pierce through the silk cloth, and an arrow at the end of its flight cannot float a goose feather. You think you can negotiate with me with your half-dead appearance? Do you feel pain in your lungs when you breathe? Do you think Duan Boer's punch was embroidery?" Su Fengyin said, "How many times can I ride my sword? Have you guessed it before? Similarly, since there was a first strike, why couldn't there be a second or third strike? It's not like I can't drag another one down with me. Killing Duan Boer, who is ranked 6th among the evil sects, doesn't seem to be as profitable as killing the youngest son of the war god." Tuoba Chunsun stretched out a finger and shook it a few times. He smiled confidently and said, "Don't try to scare me. It's useless. I grew up being beaten and scolded by this Tuoba you keep talking about. I'm not scared. I know a little about your temperament. If you can kill someone, you won't talk nonsense. Now that you are talking too much, it proves that you have exhausted all your tricks. TSK, exhausted all your tricks. That's a good saying. Since you are a descendant of the southern dynasty's Zhuoran family, you should know what I mean, right? Or should I say you are starting to scheme in the dark again? I'll wait and see. Duan Bo, or do it. You can have his limbs and I'll have his head." Tuoba Chunsun narrowed his eyes and said, "I didn't know it before, but after meeting you, I realized that you know some of the famous words in the books. Nagging and nagging will make you seem more emotional when you kill someone." Su Fengyin faced Duan Bo and exhaled gently. A ray of golden light rushed out of his sleeve. Tuoba Chunsun giggled and said, "Child's play. Your sword-controlling killing technique is worlds apart from the sword aura of one of my father's defeated opponents, the chess and sword music school." He had a frivolous expression on his face, but his eyes were cold. This flying sword that had never shown itself in the world was far superior to the 8 flying swords that were hovering in the air in terms of sword aura and speed. It was the golden strands that had formed half of the sword embryo. Tuoba Chunsun did not draw his sword. He only competed with the golden flying sword that had a tricky trajectory. He was like a passionate man teasing a girl in love, attracting bees and butterflies. The man and the flying sword were very beautiful. Su Fengyin was already facing off against Duan Bo Erwi, who was charging towards him. Duan Bo Erwi became more and more courageous as the fight went on. He was incomparably valiant, and he showed no mercy in his attacks. His entire body was wrapped in ropes, and when he moved he could destroy mountains and shake mountains. Su Fengyin did not hide his weakness. He was determined to tear off the limbs of this young man who dared to divert his attention to control the sword in front of him. Duan Boer's posture was relaxed. He attacked like a sledgehammer and attacked like a hook. His elbows seemed to be close to his ribs. He did not pull up much, but his explosive power was extremely frightening. The burly martial artist walked in the mud like a snake. His hands twisted and turned, creating an endless cycle of mutual generation. Su Fengyin had suffered a heavy blow earlier. Now that he had to multitask and attack at the same time, Duan Boer finally found an opening and raised his knee. When Su Fengyin's head was rebounded by a huge force, his arms swept out and his entire body was sent flying. Su Fengyin muttered softly, "Lend me 3,000 qi to chop off your head." The golden light exploded. The flying sword that had been hiding its strength all this while was instantly fueled by its master's desperate attempt to gain the upper hand. Its speed suddenly increased by a few times and it pierced towards Tuoba Chunsun's glabella. It was a close call. Tuoba Chunsun, who could not dodge in time, raised his hand to block the sword with his palm. He tilted his head and the flying sword pierced through his entire palm, leaving a bloody scar on his face. Duan Boer, who sensed the abnormality, was greatly shocked. He no longer pursued the young man who seemed to have no end to his tricks. He rushed to his young master's side, afraid that the flying sword still had a killer move. If Tuoba Chunsun, whom the military god had high hopes for, died in dragon waste state, not to mention Duan Boer, even the entire Beimang demon sect would not be enough to accompany him in death. Tuoba Chunsun did not look at his palm. He slapped Duan Boer's face and said furiously like a madman, "Go and kill him." The golden wisps flew in a semicircle and disappeared into his sleeve. Su Fengyin, whose face was as pale as a sheet of paper, staggered after landing on the ground. He swallowed the blood that surged up to his throat and bent his back as he ran forward. A few cavalrymen who were blocking his path were cut down along with their horses. Duan Boer turned around and chased after him. Tuoba Chunsun's 5 fingers formed a hook. He raised his head and roared, "If I don't kill you, my surname is not Tuoba." Chapter 486. The colorful python swam around the corpse of Jianghu, occasionally lowering its huge head to gently touch it. Tuoba Chunsun's right hand was pierced by the flying sword, so he pulled out a knife with his left hand and chopped off the python's head that was caught off guard. He then slashed the retainer in Jianghu. It was more bloody and cruel than whipping a corpse. Chu Char did not dare to ride on the horse, and even after dismounting he did not dare to get close to this young Tuoba for fear of being angered. Tuoba Chunsun chopped the loyal retainer that died because of him into pieces and glanced sideways at Chu Char. The latter trembled and knelt on the ground to beg for mercy. Tuoba Chunsun sneered, "Consider yourself lucky that you are an eagle master. Chu Char, send someone to bring all the eagles and riders of your tribe out. If you fail to kill the assassin who tried to assassinate me, your tribe can be removed from the prairie." Chu Char led the horse and trotted to Tuoba Chunsun's side. He handed over the reins and asked in a low voice, "What about these herdsmen?" Tuoba Chunsun said calmly, "The prairie is a promise. Naturally we will give you gold, cattle and sheep." Chu Char nodded like a chick pecking at rice and said flatteringly, "Young prince is indeed the king eagle of the prairie." Tuoba Chunsun mounted the horse and sneered, "Whether they live or die after this is none of my business." Chu Char was stunned for a moment before he came to a realization. He crossed his arms in front of his chest and lowered his head, "Young prince is wise." Tuoba Chunsun saw that there was nothing on the saddle and said expressionlessly, "Go get a strong bow and 3 quivers of arrows." Chu Char's lackey shouted. Immediately, there were horsemen who were extremely respectful and rushed over to hand over the bows and arrows. Tuoba Chunsun picked up an arrow with 2 fingers and shot a horseman at the periphery. The arrow went straight through his head and he fell off the horse. Only then did Tuoba Chunsun squint his eyes and nod. He raised his head to look at the yellow eagle that was trained by Chu Char. Once again violence rose in his heart. If Jianghu did not die with his ability to train eagles, how could Chu Char, who was once an eagle master, be a match? The great sparrow trained by that old servant could even catch and kill eagles. This kid was really lucky. Tuoba Chunsun suppressed his killing intent and squeezed the horse's belly. He ordered, "Tell that beast of yours to keep a close watch. Every time you lose track of him I'll cut out one of your eyeballs." Xianxia hurriedly mounted the horse and followed behind the young prince. He came and went in a hurry. The herdsmen of Hu Yinbao's tribe all felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted off their shoulders. For this small and weak exiled tribe, it was like the dark clouds above their heads had not dispersed, but at least it was not immediately followed by a heavy downpour. Hu Yinbao was already disheartened. He only asked his daughter-in-law to bandage Huyen Guanin's wounds. Inside the tent, the young girl's body was trembling from the pain, but she still had a determined look on her face. On the other hand, the child, Abaoji, was sobbing from the heartache. He squatted on the ground and buried his head in his knees, not daring to look at his sister's wound. Hu Yanbao said guiltily, "It's all our fault for harming this young bodhisattva from the southern dynasty." Huyen Guanin wanted to say something but stopped. The old man said worriedly, "The one who chased after our benefactor should be young Prince Tuoba." On the grassland, a soul-stirring hunt unfolded. After Su Fengyin broke out of the encirclement, Duanbua Air turned back and chased after him. The distance between them was gradually shortened until they were less than 300 meters apart. They could see each other clearly. The speed of their figures was not inferior to that of a warhorse. Behind Duanbua Air were Tuoba Chunsun, Shirdi Jinchar, and 100 riders. After casting the net, it was naturally time to reel it in. Once Su Fengyin fell into the net again, there would be no chance for him to escape. It was already shocking that he was able to kill a Vajra realm expert during the encirclement this time. Su Fengyin bent down like a leopard and did not dare to reduce his forward speed. He turned his head and took a glance at the falcon that was circling in the sky. He knew that if he slowed down his running speed, the recovery of the Great Yellow Court would naturally speed up. However, if he was entangled by Duanbua Air, he would fall into the net again. Although Tuoba Chunsun was injured by the golden strands, he still had 80 to 90% of his combat strength. On the other hand, Duanbua Air was already exhausted. It was not wrong to say that he had exhausted all his abilities. Although he did not know why his entire body was not paralyzed like what the devil in brocade robe imagined, it definitely affected his body's movements. The 8 flying swords formed green strands, the spring thunder unsheathed, the green dragon sleeve, and finally, even the golden strands of forming embryo. Duanbua Air's attacks were all solidly smashed on his body. Su Fengyin had not reached the heavenly phenomenon realm where he could borrow the heaven and earth's weather, nor was he at the earth immortal realm. If Tuoba Chunsun and Duanbua Air had given him 10 to 15 months to recuperate, he could have fought again. However, they were chasing after him urgently and wanted to eliminate him completely. Su Fengyin could only desperately breathe and heal his injuries while running forward. There was no way out. Fortunately, he had the Kaishu-style Qi-Ji that could travel 300 miles in an instant. He was used to the stinging pain from this kind of Qi-Ji and was able to grit his teeth and endure it. Duanbua Air, who had been running madly, frowned. On one hand, he was surprised by the Qi-Ji of the Southern Dynasty's Qi-Ji. On the other hand, he was even more puzzled by the wound on his leg. When the sword pierced through, he could completely ignore it with his Vajra physique. Even if he could not recover quickly, his Qi-Ji would not be blocked like now. It could be seen that the swordsman's sword-controlling technique had not reached the peak, but the flying sword itself could be considered an immortal item. This made Duanbua Air even more determined to kill this young man. As for the death of the colorful python, he did not feel any sympathy. The Tuoba family was like a large temple. A large temple would have many clay bodhisattvas. With one less bodhisattva, the rest of the bodhisattvas would have more incense offerings. Moreover, Duanbua Air had always been dissatisfied with this old servant's ranking as one of the 10 great devils. On the contrary, he admired Xia Ling and the others more. In his eyes, the old man in the brocade robe was not a devil. He was more like a laughable entertainer raised by the rich and powerful. He only knew how to use his lewd skills to seduce others. The two of them had never seen eye to eye. Duanbua Air's heroic spirit overflowed. He shouted, "Boy, do you dare to fight with me for 300 rounds?" The voice came from afar. "Call your wife or daughter over." Duanbua Air listened to the voice and discerned the Qi-Ji. This person's Qi-Ji seemed to be more vigorous than he had imagined. However, after suffering a great loss, he knew that this fellow's acting skills had reached perfection compared to his young master's. He would not be fooled so easily. Su Fengyin looked at the yellow eagle above his head again. After the time it took to burn an incense stick, Duanbua Air was shocked to find that the distance between them had narrowed to 800 feet. However, the cavalry behind him, who had been galloping in a straight line according to the falcon's instructions, had caught up. Could it be that this fellow had no sense of direction and had taken a slightly unnecessary but fatal arc? However, it was a good thing to be able to close the distance and meet up with his young master. Duanbua Air did not think too much about it. Tuoba Chunsun took the lead and rode side by side with Duanbua Air about 10 feet away. The distance between them and the dying swordsman of the Southern Dynasty was shrinking. Duanbua Air said in a low voice, "Young master, be careful of that person's flying sword." Tuoba Chunsun did not say anything. He picked up a well-made black crow feather arrow from the quiver on his back. 200 steps. Tuoba Chunsun began to draw his bow. At 120 steps, just as Tuoba Chunsun was about to shoot, the distance suddenly increased to 150 steps. Then he kept pacing back and forth between 130 and 40 steps. Tuoba Chunsun was not in a hurry. Normally, with the guy's speed, unless it was the best warhorse, it would be impossible to catch up with him. He might as well abandon his horse and chase after him. However, since he was seriously injured, it was a different matter. He was more than happy to play with this Southern Dynasty scholar slowly to death. When the time came, he would take his head and hang it in front of his family's gate. Finally, the distance between them shortened to 120 steps. Tuoba Chunsun drew his bow and shot. An arrow pierced through the air. Tuoba Chunsun took out his quiver and picked up arrows at an astonishing speed. Although there was a sequence of arrows, they all hit the man's back at the same time. It was obvious that each arrow was faster than the previous one. This was a kind of continuous arrow technique. Su Fengyin did not want to waste any of the qi in his body. He rolled forward and dodged 2 arrows. He waved his sleeve and was about to grab the last one. Tuoba Chunsun stood on the back of his horse and drew his bow to the fullest. He shot the arrow that he had been preparing for a long time. It went straight for Su Fengyin's glabella. Su Fengyin bent his finger and flicked away the previous arrow. He leaned his head back and kept his body close to the ground. He held the arrow with both hands and did a nimble roll. He used the huge force of the arrow to continue running forward. He broke the arrow in the process and suddenly raised his qi. A small part of the arrowhead was thrown into the sky. It pierced through the body of the falcon that was flying at a low altitude. Duanbua, who was still running, was dumbfounded. Tuoba Chunsun stood on the back of his horse and clenched his fist. One of his hands was dripping with blood. Su Fengyin laughed loudly. His body suddenly accelerated and the distance between them instantly increased to 100 feet. What's the use of treating you as 3 Vajra realm martial artists? If a heavenly phenomenon realm martial artist doesn't come, I won't be able to die here. I have something to do. This is the only chapter for tonight. It will explode tomorrow. By the way, I will ask for a red note. Chapter 487. Tuoba Chunsun was different from his sickly elder brother who had been dealing with medicine all year round. Tuoba Chunsun was born with divine strength. The Tuoba clan revered martial arts and valued strength. Almost all the youths in the clan had joined the army. They had high hopes for this young master who was about to step into the Vajra realm before the age of 18. This trip was also because the Beimeng military god wanted Tuoba Chunsun to break through the window paper by himself. With Tuoba Chunsun's stamina, his equestrian archery skills were quite outstanding. He could shoot arrows continuously for 200 steps without any deviation in his aim. However, he had weighed the remaining strength of the Southern Dynasty's rich son. Within 100 steps it could be fatal, but within 120 steps it could be fatal. He did not want this guy to die so easily, so he had always wanted to shoot his back at around 120 steps. It would be best if he shot his hands and feet. Every autumn hunt of the palace, Tuoba Chunsun would go hunting with the army. When he encountered large prey, he would leisurely stay at the edge of the shooting range and shoot. This was the wisdom that had been honed when his father threw him into the ice field to fight with a white bear. At that time his only weapons were a bow, a dagger and a quiver of arrows. This time, Duanbua Air was not shocked by this boy's archery skills, but he was shocked by this young man's shrewdness. Even when he was in a life-or-death situation, he still did not forget to carefully weigh the pros and cons. The group of people followed closely behind. If they disappeared from sight, they would have to rely on the yellow eagles to keep an eye on them from the sky, providing them with information. They would constantly shrink the distance between the two parties as a smokescreen. Finally, when the yellow eagles swooped down to lower their altitude, they would dodge the arrows and use the arrows to kill them. Everything was done in one go. It was as if after borrowing the qi to control the sword to injure the enemy, they had also sprinkled salt on the young master's wound. When experts exchanged blows, the outcome of the battle was often a hair's breadth away. With the yellow eagle hovering in the air, their victory was assured. Even if they were lucky enough to escape from their field of vision, as long as the general direction was correct, they were not afraid that this person would slip through the net. If they chased him all the way, they would not give him time to catch his breath and heal his injuries. Duanbo Air revealed a sinister smile. Since you can still kill an eagle to demonstrate your strength, I'll give you the straw that breaks the camel's back. His coarse face was dyed a sickly crimson red. His eyes were pitch black, and his irises gradually faded until his pupils could no longer be seen. Even the cavalry, including City Chicha, sensed the strangeness of the squire, and their horses became restless. Duan Bo-er suddenly stopped his steps and made a gesture of throwing a spear. The 100 cavalrymen who were desperately riding their horses were baffled. The young prince's retainer did not have any weapons in his hands. Was he trying to take the machete man as a bird that would be frightened by the twang of a bow? As a city from the grassland, Chu Char was experienced and knowledgeable. She stole a glance at Tuoba Chunsun, who was standing on the back of the horse. Tuoba Chunsun was indeed the son of the god of war. His servants were so powerful that any one of them could flatten a small tribe by themselves. Lightning Spear. This time, Duan Bo-er had used his chi and blood to forcefully raise his realm, stepping into the spirit void false realm. He bent his arm as if he was raising a spear and stepped on a series of pleasing intersecting steps. When he threw the spear, his left leg made a subtle but decisive step, driving his forearm forward in a whipping motion. There was an ear-piercing whoosh as a spear invisible to the naked eye pierced through the air. Wherever the spear passed, there would be ripples caused by the vacuum. It was like a comet sweeping past, arcing towards Su Fengyan's back. Duan Bo-er was born in the Chang tribe and had been good at using featherless javelins since ancient times. The javelins were slender and sharp, and those with great strength could pierce through several armors. He had participated in hunting since childhood and was known for his spear-throwing skills. When he was young, he met the great Grandmaster Spear Immortal Wuxia, who was at the peak of martial arts. He was taught the profound meaning of the spear and eventually created the lightning spear divine ability. 8 years ago, he fought with a famous demon from the Devil Path and killed him with 2 spears. Duan Bo-er did not dare to use this kind of spear technique that consumed a lot of chi and blood. Moreover, it had the advantage of catching Su Fengyan off guard and attacking from a distance. It could be seen how much importance Duan Bo-er had placed on Su Fengyan. After Su Fengyan clearly knew the identities of Tuoba Chunsun and the others, especially when he started to flee, he had been waiting for Duan Bo-er to use his famous technique. The lightning spear that was known as the 3 spears splitting mountains had finally arrived. Along the way, the scattered great yellow courtyard, other than the broken arrows used to kill the yellow eagle, were all prepared to block this spear. There was no need to think about dodging. The lightning spear that was thrown out was guided by Duan Bo-er's chi from afar. It was not like an arrow that had a fixed target. This was similar to the superior sword controlling technique. The mark between Su Fengyan's brows had already turned purplish black. He did not care if he was in the state of terminal lucidity. He stopped and turned around. Both of his hands twisted the spring lightning and his body flew backward. The spring lightning once again formed a huge mirror of chi wall in the valley. The conflict between the two was decided in this one move. Duan Bo-er was undoubtedly still a powerful crossbow. Su Fengyan's strength had become weaker. The round mirror was shattered by the lightning spear and the spring lightning was sent flying backward. The lightning spear changed its trajectory slightly and pierced into Su Fengyan's ribs. After penetrating through, it still blasted a hole as tall as a person on the ground, causing dust to fly everywhere. Duan Bo-er could be considered to have avenged Tuoba Chunsun for stabbing his palm with the flying sword. Xianxia and Bai Chi finally felt relieved. This guy was really too troublesome. This time he should have accepted his fate and died, right? Su Fengyan's body fell heavily on the ground. He struggled to sit up but he could not stand up anymore. He took the spring lightning beside him and sat down cross-legged, placing it across his knees. The blood that gushed out of his mouth had already turned black. If he did not wipe it off, it was destined that he would not be able to wipe it clean. Su Fengyan only stretched out his hand and rubbed his hair. His body, hair and skin were all given to him by his parents. Chapter 488. Ever since he was a child, Li Yishan had joked that he looked like a rich man from the north and the south. No wonder he was reincarnated into the Su family. His eldest sister, Su Jihu, always joked that of the 4 people in the family, he looked the most like their mother. Their facial features were the same, their eyes were the same, and even their hair was the same. She always said that she was very jealous. Su Fengyan's vision blurred. His mind flashed and he thought of many trivial things. He thought of Su Zhao's hunched back, the 4 siblings laughing and playing, the spirit-suppressing song of Prince Liang's mansion on Mount Qingliang, the white robe that had been a heavy shadow in his heart since he was a child, the old man's sword came and went, and the bloated hill on the military parade platform by the Guangling River. Too many people and too many things flashed by. He didn't know why, but when his life came to an end, he felt sorry for his father, Su Xiao, for not being able to take over the burden of 300,000 cavalrymen from him, and for not being able to ease his shoulders. In the end, he thought of a woman's dimples. Although they grew up together, they couldn't be called childhood sweethearts. He had lived for no more than 20 years, but he had already seen all kinds of women. Perhaps it was just as the head maidservant Sweet Potato had said. He appeared to be affectionate but was actually heartless and cold. He had cared about many women, but it seemed that he could let go of any of them. Only she, no matter whether it was the 3 years of wandering about with old Huang as a stray dog, or his travels afterwards, or this trip to northern Mang, would always think of her and feel his heart ache. If the world knew that Su Fengnian, who already had the hereditary title in his hands, was going to Beimang alone, they would definitely laugh. His Royal Highness had nothing better to do. He didn't want to be the heir, so why did he have to risk his life for something? Your father had already proven that no matter how wonderful Jianghu was in front of the cavalrymen, he could only crawl and surrender. You can just wait for the king of Bailiang to die of old age, and wear that luxurious robe of the king of Bailiang. Why not? Even if the whole world knew that Chen Jibao was a thorn in their throat and that they would most likely lose to him, even if the Su Fengnian turned a blind eye, it would only result in the loss of military power. The king of Bailiang was still the king of Bailiang, and the white-clothed war immortal was still the white-clothed war immortal. One sat in Bailiang and the other sat on the border. The two sides were clearly separated, and the well water did not interfere with the river water. This was already enough to make people drool. Don't be discontented and don't overestimate your capabilities. Regardless of whether you are Royal Highness or an idiot, even if you go to the Bailiang army, no matter how many military merits you accumulate, will you be able to challenge Chen Bai, who rose from the Great War of the Spring and Autumn period? You can force soldiers Saint Yi Baikue to death? How many years do you have to build a direct line of soldiers under Chen Jibao's nose? Taking a step back, Chen Jibao killed Great Grandmaster Wang Xiu, who was once as famous as Li Chenggang in Fengdu green robe and Fu Jiang in red armor. What qualifications does Su Fengnian have to compete with him on the same stage? In the entire Liang dynasty, no one thought that he could be like the king of Bailiang and control the 300,000-strong cavalry. It was funny, but this seemed to be the reason why the middle-aged man in the capital, Great Peace City, allowed the eldest son of the king of Bailiang to do whatever he wanted. In such a big dynasty that ruled the spring and autumn period, there was not a single young person who was so important to the emperor. Su Fengnian's fingers trembled as he tied his loose knot. That night, Su Xiao said, "Fengnian, if you die in Beimang, Bailiang will be handed over to Chen Jibao. The Bailiang army has changed its tune. This is nothing to me, Su Xiao. But if you die as your father, I can only do what your mother did when she entered the palace alone. I can't take revenge." Su Fengnian joked at that time, "As a father, you are really useless. If my disappointing son dies in Beimang, you can lead the Bailiang cavalry all the way to Beimang's palace. How domineering would that be?" Su Xiao was silent for a long time. In the end he chuckled and said, "Father also wants to and will do that. But I'm afraid that you will really die, so I said some discouraging words to deceive you. My Su family has 300,000 cavalry. No matter what, we will destroy half of Beimang's national strength. How can father do such a domineering thing better than you?" Su Fengnian laughed and said, "Of course I won't die if I don't have to." Just thinking about it made him sullen. Su Xiao, who never hit this son of his, slapped Su Fengnian's head. The general, who never believed in ghosts, actually spat a few times and jokingly scolded him, "Don't say such discouraging words." Then he muttered to himself a few times, "Children's words carry no harm." Su Fengnian replied helplessly, "You're already 20 years old. What children's words carry no harm?" Su Xiao shook his head and didn't say anything else. Su Fengnian closed his eyes and put his hands on the spring thunder. He understood some things. Why did Su Xiao still like to sew shoes like an old farmer? Shenyuan Jingqing should have been like Zhang Julu, knowledgeable about the world. At the very least he could have been close to Sun Ping. But he was blocked outside the door of his family of 3, on the Mount Hui of the Shenyuan surname. Even if he became a Confucian sage, he still couldn't take half a step out. The one who rode the ox eventually went down the mountain. But what was the difference between going down the mountain and going up the mountain? Old Man Li wearing a sheepskin coat at 16 years old, King Kong at 19 years old, Xianxia at 24 years old, celestial phenomenon. Why was it that after losing his arm, he was still at the gates of hell on the river, making a few smiles and a flying sword? In the end it was all one word. Su Fengnian thought of her dimples and stood up shakily. Even if he didn't admit it, he knew that he liked her. If he didn't like her, how could he not get tired of looking at her after so many years? He just didn't know that he liked her so much. Since he liked her but couldn't say it out loud, he shouldn't die here. After Su Fengnian opened his eyes, he wiped the blood with his sleeve and shouted with a smile, "Jiang and I like you." Tuoba Chun's son laughed coldly, but he couldn't laugh again. A young woman came over on a sword. Behind her, there was a Confucian in a green robe who was walking on the waves. The woman stood on a long sword, floating in the air in front of the guy who was in a dead end. She glared and said angrily, "Why did you call me? Shameless." Chapter 489. It was a scene of a young man and a young woman reuniting after a long separation. The man fought against 3 Vajra realm experts by himself and even killed one of them. Even though he was defeated, it was still an honorable defeat. If this news spread out, it would be enough to shake Beimang. On the other hand, the beautiful woman wielded her sword out of thin air. When such a man and woman met in such a manner, except for a blind man, everyone would feel that it was rather spectacular and heartwarming. However, the woman's words seemed to be a little unfathomable. Chuchatra was shocked by the woman's appearance and sword control. The 100-odd cavalrymen behind him looked at each other in dismay. How were they going to fight? Duanbua Erwi didn't wait for Tuoba Chunsun to say anything. He was furious and threw out the thunder spear for the second time. It drew a sharp arc in the sky that was filled with killing intent as it fell towards Su Fengyan's head. The white-haired Confucian in green robes was calm and composed. He landed on his tiptoes and reached out a hand, gently grabbing the thunder spear that was shaking the air. He clenched his 5 fingers and broke the thunder spear into 2 with ease. It was like a child throwing a stone that was casually bounced away by a strong young man. Tuoba Chunsun's face turned gloomy. After Duanbua Erwi deflected the 2 spears, his chi and blood were surging. When he saw the gaze of his young master, he felt bitter. He took a deep breath and was ready to throw out another spear to check the situation of the old scholar. However, when this devil didn't care about his internal injuries and raised his chi activity, Tuoba Chunsun saw the middle-aged scholar in Southern Dynasty's attire waving his sleeve. The wind and clouds in heaven and earth changed as he waved his sleeve like a dragon. Duanbua Erwi's chi activity was like a battlement that was hit by a huge rock that weighed 1,000 kilograms. He staggered a few steps back and spat out a mouthful of blood. His chi was extremely chaotic. Duanbua Erwi was indeed a loyal servant. He shouted in exasperation, "Young master, leave quickly. Don't bother about me." Tuoba Chunsun's feet were rooted to the ground, and his body didn't move an inch. It wasn't that he didn't want to leave, but it was as if he was wrapped in endless strands of fate and couldn't move. After the middle-aged scholar kept his sleeve, he said lightly, "I'm Chao Changqing from West Chu. Many years ago I took in this disciple, Su Qi, in Beimang Southern Dynasty. I don't know how you got into a situation where you won't rest until one of you is dead?" Chucharer and the group almost fell off their horses. Chao Changqing? This was the first celestial being who entered Liang Imperial Palace 3 times. "If you have the ability, go show your prowess to my father. Why are you being calculative with a junior like me?" Chao Zhangqing smiled and said, "Young prince, don't try to provoke me with words. If I have the chance, I will fight with Bodhisattva Tuoba. However, I believe that Deng Teya has already passed Gusai State and is heading north to the imperial tent. If I go there now, I will be suspected of taking advantage of him." Tuoba Chunsun suddenly smiled brightly and said with a cheeky smile, "Uncle Chao, you are being too serious. Among the 10 people on the martial roll, other than Wang Xinji from the Martial Emperor City, my father respects you the most. He personally said that Chao Qingyi is the well-deserved Confucian saint in this world. I didn't know this person was Uncle Chao's disciple. If I'm rude, I hope Uncle Chao doesn't mind. No wonder this person could kill my retainer. His name is Su Qi. Congratulations to the Southern Dynasty for having a young talent who can stand shoulder to shoulder with Yelu Dongbei and Murong Longjiang." Chao Changqing only said, "I just entered the realm of land Immortal. I'll definitely fight with Tuoba in half a year." Tuoba Chunsun was so angry that he almost vomited blood. He wanted to slap himself. The 3 sects had 2 sages, Qilin and Buddha Dragon Tree. He was wondering why Confucianism, the most powerful sect, lacked a land immortal. And it just so happened to be Su Qi's master. Tuoba Chunsun calmed his mind, and he no longer had his cold-blooded temper and arrogance from before. He lowered his head and asked gently, "Uncle Chao, can I return to the Northern Dynasty?" The lady whose beauty could be ranked in the top 3 leaped down from the great Liang Dragon Sparrow sword. She faced Tuoba Chunsun and said coldly, "If you want to kill him, I'll kill you." The great Liang Dragon Sparrow was intelligent. It circled around the lady like a little bird. This scene made Duanbo shudder. How old was this lady? Was she really a sword immortal? A female sword immortal in her 20s? Tuoba Chunsun cursed this Southern Dynasty scholar with the surname Su. Not only did he have a master that made others jealous, but he also had a beauty that even he was jealous of. He quickly smiled and said, "Since I already know that Brother Su Qi is Uncle Chao's direct disciple, I won't dare to provoke you. Goodbye. When we return to the Northern Dynasty, the Tuoba clan will treat Uncle Chao and the rest with respect." Tuoba Chunsun solemnly bowed and bade farewell. Just like that, the curtain fell on the hunting expedition that was as loud as thunder and as heavy as raindrops. Su Fengyan's vision was still blurry. He was like a fish that was thrown onto the shore. He gasped for air and laughed while enduring the pain. "Little mud man, if you talk like that, others will misunderstand that I'm living off you." Jianghu raised her eyebrows and was about to reward him with a sword. However, she held herself back when she saw his condition. She disdained to hit him when he was down. Su Fengyan sat down. His tense heartstrings relaxed again and again. He kept vomiting blood but still controlled a flying sword to nourish his fetus. Chao Changqing smiled and shook his head. He walked to His Royal Highness and sat down cross-legged in front of Su Fengyan. He didn't delay Su Fengyan from using the secret technique of Wu family sword tomb to nurture the flying sword. When the flying sword entered his sleeve, he tapped 16 acupoints consecutively with one finger to temporarily suppress Su Fengyan's qi dynamic. He said warmly, "His Royal Highness has actually just entered the realm of Great Vajra, cultivating both Buddhism and Taoism. This is surprising and delightful." Su Fengyan, whose face was pale, frowned and smiled bitterly. "Great Vajra realm? Similar to Li Xiaoxin of the two Zen temples?" Chao Changqing smiled and nodded. "Even though she has just entered this realm, she's not much different from an ordinary mature Vajra realm." Su Fengyan glanced at the little mud man who had her back facing him deliberately. He asked curiously, "Why is she riding a sword and flying?" Chao Changqing was about to speak when Jianghu snorted coldly as if to remind him. This official smiled and didn't explain. Chapter 490. Su Fengyan smiled and said, "If I had to guess, it must be that practicing swordsmanship is too difficult and only picked the most fun and scary sword riding with old Li, right?" Jianghu turned around and said angrily, "What? Even if I only know how to ride a sword, I'm still better than you. You came to Beimeng alone and pretended to be a master. Without your retinue and Bailiang cavalry, you were still beaten so badly." Look, a casual sentence had revealed the truth. Chao Changqing smiled warmly. No matter what, the princess couldn't win against this Bailiang crown prince. Su Fengyan had a chance to breathe. His complexion gradually improved and the mark between his eyebrows turned from black to dark purple. He covered his chest and asked carefully, "How is old Senior Li?" Chao Changqing sighed and said, "If he forced himself to hold on, he should have had 10 more years. But old Senior went with the flow and didn't care about his life. He felt that 3 or 4 years was enough to teach the princess the way of the sword." The little clay man's eyes turned red and moist. He choked and said, "It's all your fault." Su Fengyan was silent. Chao Changqing said softly, "The purpose of this trip north was to contact a few people of the spring and autumn period who were born in West Chu. Before I entered Beimeng, I went to Bailiang Palace and met the great general. Only then did I know that your whereabouts were leaked. I promised to kill Chen Zhibao to repay the favor, but your highness didn't agree. Later on, the great general also declined. The great general only asked me to pass a message to you." Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Speak." Chao Changqing flicked his fingers and continued to treat Su Fengyan's injuries. He said, "The great general wants your highness to go home early." Su Fengyan smiled bitterly and said, "It's easy for you to say." Jianghu said angrily, "You asked for it." Su Fengyan glared at her and she glared back at him. They stared at each other. Chao Changqing pretended not to see and said, "After your whereabouts were leaked, there were 2 people in Beimeng who were hired to kill you. I only know one of them is a blind female zither player from the Ten Devil Path. She is just like the Korean Rinmao of the Liang dynasty. She is the best at pointing fingers and killing Vajras." Jianghu sneered, "Remember to run when you see her. Don't forget your life when you see her." Su Fengyan snapped, "When men speak, women shut up." Jianghu flew into a rage, "I'll stab you to death." Su Fengyan gave him a sideways glance. "That's my sword. Aren't you embarrassed? It has only been 3 days since we last met, and I have a whole new level of respect for you. Putting aside your swordsmanship, the thickness of your skin is comparable to mine." Jianghu's pretty face flushed red, and the great Liang dragon sparrow sword flew at an astonishing speed. Chao Changqing felt a bit of a headache. Wasn't it a bit inappropriate for an outsider to be flirting in such a way? However, He quickly recalled His Royal Highness's even more inappropriate confession and immediately felt relieved. Enemies always meet. She hit the nail on the head. Su Fengyan laughed. Little mud man, have you gotten calluses on your hands? Let me take a look and I'll know if you've been slacking off. Jianghu replied with His Royal Highness's catchphrase, shut up. However, compared to Su Fengyan's shut up, her momentum was much weaker. Chao Changqing said slowly, it was the king of Bailiang who gave me the approximate route to the north, and I was able to meet His Royal Highness in time. Otherwise, I would feel guilty for the rest of my life. Su Fengyan shook his head and laughed. Congratulations to Sir for becoming a saint. Chao Changqing said calmly, it's all thanks to the princess's calligraphy and sword control. Su Fengyan couldn't hide the surprise on his face. The little mud man snorted a few times, and his limpid eyes were obviously complacent. Su Fengyan asked, when will you leave for Gusai Prefecture of the Southern Dynasties? The green-robed Confucian who had reached the realm of Confucian saints smiled and said, we'll have to wait until His Royal Highness recovers. The little mud man fanned the flames and said, Master, master, master. Su Fengyan smiled but didn't say anything. Chao Changqing squinted his eyes and smiled brightly. He said, the prince is indeed a master. Facing 3 Vajra realm martial artists, you fought and killed one of them. The closed sword technique, which was born from the sword opening gate, and the 12 swords given by Dong Tai, will definitely shock the 2 Jianghu in the future. Su Fengyan shook his head and sighed, not to mention Elder Li and Mr. Chao, even compared to White Fox's face, he's still far behind. Not to mention there's a bull rider. Jianghu curled his lips and said, compared to Hong Shixiang and Nangong Push, he's really shameless. Su Fengyan nodded seriously and said, if he's shameless, how can he say he likes you? You're the same. I just called out your name and you rushed over on your sword. Jianghu was instantly defeated and threw away his armor. His ears turned red. He wanted to say something but couldn't say a word. Chao Changqing tactfully turned a deaf ear. Su Fengyan and Jianghu said at the same time, I'll kill you with one sword. Jianghu, who had been defeated again and again, hurriedly left on his sword. One sword came from the west and one sword went to the east. Only Su Fengyan and Chao Changqing were left at the scene. Su Fengyan asked, it's okay for him to leave like this, right? Chao Changqing smiled and said, it's okay. Everything within 100 miles is under my control. His Royal Highness can heal himself. Su Fengyan closed his eyes and concentrated. Jianghu stood on the sword 10 miles away in one breath. Her long sleeves fluttered in the wind like a fairy. She bit her lips and was about to cry. She carelessly wiped her cheeks and said to herself, don't cry. Chao Changqing calmed himself down and felt a little emotional. After parting ways in the Jiangnan circuit, the princess and his uncle returned to the old West Chu. In the beautiful mountains and limpid waters, regarding the unique cultivation method he taught her, she slacked off for 3 days to fish and 2 days to dry the net. She only diligently took care of a vegetable garden, never getting tired of it. Otherwise, she would lie on the table in her room in a daze counting copper coins. It wasn't until she saw Li Chungang, who broke 2,600 armor with one sword by the Guangling River, that she smiled. However, she was not interested in learning swordsmanship after that. She only put in some effort to practice her calligraphy. It was only when he said that he was going to northern Mang and might have to make a trip to the northern Liang prince's mansion that she picked up the great Liang dragon finch and took the initiative to practice swordsmanship. After bargaining with Li Chungang for an entire day, she finally chose the most outstanding swordsmanship, imperial sword manipulation. However, the princess's temperament was really mischievous and lazy. She was afraid of heights since young. Even if she occasionally mustered up the courage to imperial sword manipulation, she would only fly a few feet above the ground. Her diligence in imperial sword manipulation increased the closer she got to northern Liang. It was only when she heard that Su Fengyan was rushing to northern Mang that she began to truly focus on imperial sword manipulation. Flying on the sword over the mountain peak. Flying on the sword across the river. Her momentum was like a rainbow. Her realm improved by leaps and bounds. Even Chao Changqing was shocked and amazed. Chapter 491. Chao Changqing took advantage of Su Fengyan's meditative state to take a few glances at him. There was no doubt that he had just entered the Vajra realm. Compared to when he first met him in Gangnam-do, his aura was much grander. In West Chu, he and Li Chungang had nothing to do, drinking and discussing heroes. The old god of swords had mentioned this ill-fated prince of Bailiang many times. His words were full of praise and criticism, and he had raised his future achievements to the same level as Bai Huer's face at Tide Listening Pavilion and Xianxia at Mount Longhu. The old senior had praised this young man's tenacity, unlike the usual playboys. Although his martial arts talent was slightly inferior to Hong Xixiang's, he could make up for it with hard work. Moreover, he was so afraid of death that he was willing to use the stupidest method to improve his realm. The only thing he disliked was that this young man was affectionate and heartless towards women. Whenever he saw a beautiful girl, he could not help but flirt with her. His skill in defecating was superb, but he was careless in wiping his ass. He was like this to the West Chu remnant Yu Xuanji and Princess Jing and Pei Nanwei, which made the old man roll his eyes. Chao Changqing did not have a good or bad impression of this young man. However, he was able to refuse the temptation of giving away the princess in exchange for killing Qin Jibao. Chao Changqing had been through ups and downs in the officialdom and was already experienced in the ways of the world. He was only slightly surprised. Long-term planning was his forte. If Su Fengnian had agreed at that time, it would have been really disappointing. With the princess's stubbornness, she would not hesitate to stab this heartless man to death or never see him again for the rest of her life. Chao Changqing was actually happy with such a situation. It was far less worrisome than the current situation. However, when the princess came riding on her sword and heard the confession of a dying man, Chao Changqing could not help but sigh. Back then in the palace of West Chu, he entered the palace at a young age and played the jade pieces for so many years. Who was he playing for? Did she know that person? Perhaps even before she died, she only thought that this chess player was giving pointers to the emperor, right? Compared to this young man in front of him, even if he was already a Confucian saint, wasn't he inferior? Chao Changqing turned his head and looked in the direction where the little princess, the pillar of the old West Chu, flew on her sword and sighed. She and Su Fengnian were destined to part ways. In the future she would be forced to risk her life because of her uncle and the fate of the West Chu country. Was this why she was so lazy to practice the sword under the guise of being afraid of suffering? Chao Changqing collected his thoughts. Seeing that Su Fengnian's qi had reached a critical point, he gently tapped his fingers to help him climb up Mount Kunlun. In this battle, his meridians were severely damaged. Even with the protection of the Great Yellow Court, which had been unique in Taoism for hundreds of years, it was not easy. Why did His Royal Highness have to do this? Chao Changqing smiled. In his opinion, in times of chaos, wealth and honor were sought in the narrow path. In times of prosperity one had to walk the bright path. Su Fengnian, the nobleman's son, seemed to be in the middle. He looked bright on the surface but he was dangerous on the inside. Chao Changqing did not have any pity for him. Since he was born into the Su family he had to be aware of the difficulties. The princess whose real name was Jianghu was the same. How could she be an indifferent woman with great fortune on her back? After Su Fengnian's 3 Qi revolutions he opened his eyes and asked, "Are you really going to restore the West Chu dynasty? Is that why you came to Beimang to contact the survivors?" Chao Changqing did not hide this. He nodded and said, "That's right. Many of the West Chu survivors are now powerful ministers of the Southern Dynasty in Beimang. Before I arrived at the border, I went to the Liang Palace and carved words on the 9 Dragons Wall, revealing my identity as the princess to the world. The imperial court began to set up a literary prison. The king of Guangling also personally led troops to suppress the 6 academies. The old grand preceptor of the capital, Sun Shiji, resigned and returned to his hometown. The students of the imperial college were agitated. The left chancellor and right chancellor's pretense of affection was completely broken. The emperor of the Zhao family did not approve of the old grand preceptor's resignation, but allowed Huan Wen to resign from his position as the left chancellor and go to Guangling Taoism to be the administrator to appease the public opinion of the scholars. Su Fengnian smiled bitterly and said, "Fortunately it's her. Otherwise she would definitely hate you for making things difficult for her." Chao Changqing said calmly, "No matter if the restoration of the country fails or succeeds, I will definitely apologize to the princess with my death at an appropriate time. I have to give the princess peace and stability." Su Fengnian changed the heavy topic and asked with a frown, "Why did Dong Tai go to the northern dynasty to provoke Tuoba?" Chao Changqing, who was sitting upright and still, stretched out 2 fingers to stroke a lock of hair and smiled. 3 months ago I fought with him at the ruins of the Western Wall. It was at that time that I had ascended. Dong Tai said that fighting with me was boring and wanted to go to Tuoba to ask for a beating. However, although Dong Tai said it lightly, I know that this time he will not fight with Wang Xianji. He will only use the martial emperor city as a whetstone to sharpen his sword. This time there will only be 2 results. Either he will die at the hands of Tuoba, or he will survive and become a sword immortal. Dong Tai swordsmanship is only used to kill people. If he becomes a sword immortal, he will really have a chance to shake Wang Xinji's throne as the world's #1. Since the 12 flying swords were given to His Royal Highness, I guess when Dong Tai will stop using the Peach Blossom branch, the world will no longer dare to say that Wang Xinji and Tuoba can easily kill the remaining 8 people if they work together. Your Highness will continue to go deeper into Beimang in the future. Let's wait and see. Su Fengyin smiled and said, since you have become a saint, this statement is not valid. Chao Changqing shook his head and said, in the eyes of the world, the saints of the 3 sects have high realms. However, when it comes to killing, they are too weak. This time, I entered the realm of Earth Immortal to build momentum for the princess. If I were to fall into the eyes of the hidden experts, I would only be a laughing stock. Su Fengyin went straight to the point and joked, sir, you are too modest. A saint is a saint. Who dares to look down on you? If I had your realm and didn't have any status to worry about, I would also go to the palace to make a scene and embarrass the 9-5 sovereign. Chao Changqing's fingers stopped beside a strand of hair. He then folded his hands on his knees and said with a smile, if such a day really comes, Chao Changqing will definitely go and watch. Su Fengyin smiled and said, I was just saying. Sir, don't take it seriously. Chapter 492. Chao Changqing glanced at the vast grassland that stretched as far as the eye could see and said calmly, back in the day there was an old man from West Chu who rushed to the frontier fortress. His horizons were broadened and he was deeply moved. This Hanlin also changed his poetry from that of a dancer to that of a scholar official. It can be seen that your Highness left Beiliang's eaves and went to Beimang alone. You have the foresight and boldness to establish your own family. Very good. Su Fengyin said bitterly, if teacher hadn't arrived in time, there's an 80 to 90% chance that I would have died here. Chao Changqing stared at the young man's face and said in a low voice, do you know how many times the king of Beiliang has fallen into a life-threatening situation in his military life? Su Fengyin said softly, Su Xiao is only a second-ranked martial artist, but he likes to take the lead. He himself said that it was because of great luck that he didn't die. He also said that he actually has the ability to lead a province's military and government. It's just that he was somehow pushed to the high position of king with a different surname. Chao Changqing said ruefully, the great general has attracted a lot of hatred and burdens for the Zhao family by becoming the king with a different surname. Do you think that the king of Zhao family doesn't want to do this? It's just that he doesn't have the national power yet. It's just like how the Empress of Beimang still doesn't have the national power to break through the gates of Beiliang. Su Fengyin smiled and said, teacher, I suspect that you're trying to sow discord. Chao Changqing laughed and said, your Highness, you and I are well aware of that. Su Fengyin smiled but didn't say anything. The two of them looked at each other in silence. Su Fengyin finally frowned and said, it's a pity that Tuoba Chun's son left alive. Although teacher has temporarily taken in a cheap disciple and raised a flag for me with the Tuoba family's background, it won't take long to find some clues. Chao Changqing said indifferently, the reason I saved him was to return the favor that Gangnam-do owed. From now on, I don't owe the Su family anything. Otherwise, with the enmity between the king of Beiliang and West Chu, it would be against my status if I didn't kill your Highness. Su Fengyin said, we don't owe you any more. Chao Changqing suddenly shook his head as if he was helpless. On the other side, Jianghu controlled his great Liang dragon sparrow to cut through the sky and made a big circle to intercept Tuoba Chunsun's group. Seeing that Chao Zhangqing was not there, Tuoba Chunsun secretly let out a sigh of relief and said with a smile, may I know what advice you have for me? Jianghu said indifferently, go to hell. Tuoba Chunsun suppressed his anger and murderous intent. He was still smiling as he said innocently, Uncle Chao has magnanimously let me go. Why don't you smile and forget about the enmity? Jianghu jumped off the flying sword that was even more worthy of its name than Su Fengyin's. After landing on the ground, he did not waste time talking nonsense with this little Tuoba. He put his index and middle fingers together and whispered, Lin. The great Liang's dragon sparrow pierced through the sky in an instant. Its majestic aura was not inferior to Bo Air's thunder spear. Tuoba Chunsun's pupils contracted violently. He quickly took out an arrow from his quiver and shot it with his bow. The arrow hit the flying sword accurately. Not only was it bounced off, but it was also crushed by the majestic sword aura. The great Liang's dragon sparrow didn't slow down. Tuoba Chunsun, who was sitting on the horse, was defeated by the arrow. He pulled out his Mang saber and held it in front of him to block the flying sword. The Mang saber trembled slightly and was cut in half. Tuoba Chunsun lowered his head, threw away the Mang saber and dodged off the horse. The flying sword circled back to Jianghu, which was equivalent to drawing a complete circle. Formation. Jianghu bent his middle finger and put it on his thumb, gently forming a seal. What a great celestial being sitting in the dark, the sword in the vast ocean. If Li Chungang saw this scene, he would definitely boast that his disciple was more worthy of the 500-year praise than him. The flying sword soared in the sky, turning and turning as it wished. The sword was like antelope hanging from the horns, drawing a dazzling trajectory. Chuchar and the others only saw young Prince Tuoba being chased in all directions like a dog that had fallen into the water, while this Zishai and the 100 cavalrymen all dismounted from their horses and crouched on the ground at the same time, afraid that they would be caught in the crossfire. Bo-Er was afraid of the flying sword's speed and sharpness. He only dared to use his chi to meet the enemy, helping his young master to share the burden of the tide-like sword aura. This young woman cultivated the heavenly way of the Confucian school that Chao Changqing taught her and the supreme way of the sword that Li Chungang painstakingly created. No one in the world could be like her, who had both a gifted foundation and an unparalleled amount of luck. Ordinary martial artists had to painstakingly climb up the stairs, looking at the mountains and sighing at their inadequacies. She was the only one who could reach the heavenly way in a single step and still recklessly waste natural resources. She would slack off from time to time and always like to be in a daze on the way to the top. However, it was precisely such a woman who did not put much effort into the way of the sword that Li Chungang recognized as a person who could still reach the peak of the way of the sword even though her way of the sword had already reached a high level. When Su Fengyin saw the little clay man returning on the flying sword in a huff, he asked Chao Changqing softly, "She went to find trouble with Tuoba Chunsun?" Chao Guanzi smiled and nodded. Of course she didn't kill him. Tuoba Chunsun and that retainer were probably apprehensive of my existence, so they didn't fight back. Su Fengyin asked, "Mister, can you give me another 4 hours to recuperate so that I can talk to Jiang and I?" Chao Changqing nodded expressionlessly. After 4 hours, Su Fengyin slowly exhaled a long breath with a normal expression. By the time he staggered to his feet, Chao Changqing had already disappeared without a trace. A few miles away, Chao Changqing grabbed the gray hair hanging down from his temples with both hands and looked at the sky with narrowed eyes. How many separations and separations could a person endure? Su Fengyin walked toward the woman whose back was facing him in the distance. She heard the approaching footsteps and sneered, "The next time we meet, it will be the time of your death." Su Fengyin stood side by side with her and looked toward the south together. He did not provoke her verbally. After so many years of bickering, she was always defeated. She said coldly, "If you dare to die in Beimang." Su Fengyin rolled his eyes and interrupted her, "I know what you want to say. You want to find my corpse and whip it to vent your anger, right?" She bit her lips and turned her head away fiercely. "It's good that you know." Su Fengyin hesitated for a moment and walked in front of her. He touched her forehead and said gently, "I will practice my saber with all my heart. You should practice your sword with all your heart. Let's make a deal. If you lose to me in the future, I won't let you go." She had originally wanted to curse him, say something about how he could beat her with his mediocre martial arts, or that she could already fly on a sword or something like that. But for some reason, just looking at him covered in blood, she felt very unfamiliar. Suddenly, her eyes turned red and she could not hide the tears in her eyes. Su Fengyin reached out a finger and tapped on her cheek. "Dimple?" Chapter 493. Jiang and I rode on his sword with his hands behind his back while Chao Guanzi, who was wearing a green robe with wide sleeves, floated in the air. Both of them were immortal figures. Even though Chao Changqing knew that speaking now would spoil the mood, he still had his duty as a subject. There were some things that had to be said regardless of whether they were heard or not. This child Tuoba Chunsun purely used algebra to suppress and win over people's hearts, so he can only be considered to have passed the imperial examinations. However, he is Tuoba Chunsun's son and will most likely enlist into the army step by step in the future. Using his power to suppress people can instead increase his marks, so he can be considered to have passed the imperial examinations. However, if he were to be transferred from the military world to the imperial court, he still wouldn't be of much use. He is far inferior to Dong Zhuo, who was born in the wilderness and is smooth and slick in social relations. "Princess, this time when you go to Beimang South Prefecture's capital city to receive the old officials of West Chu, young master only needs to show up once. As for the rest of the trivial matters, you can leave them to me to handle." Back then, 30 to 40% of the aristocratic families in the imperial court fled north to cross the border. Other than their selfish desire to not let the inheritance of their family line be severed, they didn't blindly cherish their lives. Many families endured humiliation for the sake of an important mission. They were all waiting for Princess Jianghu, who was 3 feet above the ground on his sword, gave a soft hum of acknowledgement. This made Chao Changqing stunned for a moment. In the past, when he talked about the restoration of the dynasty with the princess, he always didn't hide his absent-mindedness. He didn't know why he had changed. In the mountain forest of Honglu Cave, where the second branch of the King's Qi of West Chu was located, nearly 60 people entered the mountain one after another and settled down. After his selection, the gathering of heroes was like a small imperial court. Among these pillars of the old West Chu, there were great talents who pretended to escape Zen and live in seclusion. There were literary giants who had supervised the Nanyue Temple from afar for 20 years, and a group of power generals who would rather be poor and live in seclusion. These years they didn't hesitate to fake their deaths to deceive others. After seeing the princess, these loyal officials all knelt down and wept bitterly. However, the princess didn't seem to feel anything about this, which made many of the old officials rack their brains and worry at the same time. However, no one doubted that the little princess carried fate on her back. In the Battle of the Western Fortress, Yi Baikue died in battle. In the imperial city, all the important officials, including Chao Changqing and old Grand Preceptor Sun Shiji, had seen with their own eyes His Majesty put the imperial jade seal, which was widely recognized as the most significant heirloom of the 9 kingdoms of spring and autumn, on the back of the little princess. The brilliance of the imperial jade seal, which symbolized the fate of a country, faded and dimmed. It became no different from an ordinary piece of jade and was completely transferred to her. It was the dusk of an empire that was about to collapse. The 9 courtiers knelt in the throne room together. Chao Zhangqing could still remember the ear-piercing sound of the hot jade seal burning the tender back and the bitter and desolate cries of the young princess. Jianghu's eyes were determined. "Uncle, I know that the reason why you became a saint and took me to the Western Wall and the Imperial Mausoleum is to secretly transfer your state and the remaining fate of West Chu to me. You don't have to hide it anymore. I will accept it all." Chao Guanzi's eyes were gentle as he softly said, "Princess, you don't need to care about the thoughts of the ministers. The princess being by our side is already the greatest grace. You don't need to pay any price. Chao Zhangqing and the old and orphans are scheming. The princess can place all her thoughts on that small vegetable garden." Su Fengyin was willing to send the princess back to West Chu. If Chao Zhangqing can't give the princess a stable life, then there's no need to revive the country. Jianghu slowed down the speed of her sword and said softly, "He's not afraid of death. Why should I be afraid of pain? I won't count coins anymore." The official, who had unknowingly turned from a young man to an old Confucian scholar in his 50s, nodded and said with a mischievous smile, "Okay. Even if you secretly count, Chao Changqing will only pretend that he didn't see it." Jianghu smiled brightly, revealing 2 dimples. She clenched her fist and waved it. "Uncle, tell me about the first level of martial arts. I didn't pay attention before." Chao Changqing smiled from the bottom of his heart. There are 4 levels of the first level: Vajra Finger, Celestial Phenomenon, and Land Immortal. The Vajra realm is derived from Buddhism's invincible golden body. Finger is the abbreviation of Taoism's Shentong. It means to ask about longevity. Celestial Phenomenon is the vast realm that we Confucians pursue. When the world isn't peaceful, it's up to the scholars to cultivate their bodies and govern the country. Whether it's writing or meritorious deeds, they have to use the vast righteousness to protest against injustice. However, most of the scholars only study to obtain scholarly honors for the emperor. They rarely study for the millions of people. As for the Land Immortal, they can travel outside their body and roam freely between heaven and earth. They can truly be unrestrained. Although the first 3 levels of the first level are named after the essence of the 3 sects, they usually don't have much to do with the people of the 3 sections. On the contrary, martial artists who pursue the path of Tao through strength step by step become the focus of attention in Jianghu. The eminent monks of Buddhism habitually cast the great Vajra, which has the characteristic of golden blood. Currently there are only 2 or 3 monks who have become such Buddhas. As for the Taoist spiritual masters, once they enter the first level, it's finger. After Mount Wudong's flood, no one has entered the finger. The situation of the Taoist ancestral court, Mount Longhu, is slightly better, but there are only a few of them. As for the scholars, there are even fewer of them who have entered the first level. Jiang and I thought about it seriously and said, excluding the ordinary martial artists of the 3 sects, can it be understood that one must first train the body of Vajra, then enter the finger which seeks Qi? Then from the Qi to the celestial phenomenon, one can steal the fate of heaven and earth and resonate with it? If that's the case, why does the celestial phenomenon expert seem like a thief? Chao Changqing laughed happily and nodded. Princess's words hit the nail on the head. Those who steal will be killed by those who steal the country, that's the logic. Jianghu then remembered that her uncle was the #1 celestial phenomenon expert who occupied all 8 levels. She blushed with shame. Chao Changqing, who was following Jianghu, squinted his eyes and said, I once had a chessboard deduction. For 7 or 8 land immortals to appear in the world at the same time, that's already the limit of a chess game. Chapter 494. Jianghu asked softly, will he become one of them? Chao Changqing shook his head and sighed. It'll be difficult. Jianghu tilted her head and asked, then what about me? Chao Changqing said decisively, you'll definitely be one of them. Jianghu seemed to have realized something and said angrily, he always lied to me and said that I was stupid and that my talent was mediocre. Chao Changqing was in an extremely good mood and was no longer as old-fashioned as before. He joked, I'll stab him to death with one sword. Jianghu instinctively used a finger to poke her own cheek and then rubbed her face with both hands. She mumbled to herself in a muffled voice. The tip of the great Liang dragon sparrow sword suddenly pointed upwards and she flew into the clouds. One person and one sword soared above the sea of clouds. Chao Changqing looked up but she was already nowhere to be seen. He muttered to himself, what a majestic sight. Within the borders of the old West Chu, unlike the other countries of the spring and autumn period, a pillar of clouds that connected to the heavens suddenly condensed the fate energy within a radius of 1,000 kilometers. In the imperial astronomer of Great Peace City, an old man who was observing the heavens suddenly changed his expression and hurriedly ran back to his library. Su Fengnian stood there in a daze for a long time before he finally came back to his senses and touched the relatively complete skin mask. This mask was made according to Su Qi, a descendant of a small clan in the southern dynasties. It was the most crucial part of the masks. Man's calculations were not as good as God's plans. After all, he had become enemies with Tuoba Chun's son. He was afraid that when he returned to his family and used the resources to investigate this Su Qi, Chao Changqing's temporary cover would not last long. However, during this period of time, it was still relatively safe. Su Fengnian carefully changed the skin mask and lowered his head to look at his blood-stained and tattered clothes. He sighed heavily and had no choice but to turn around and head south. As he breathed and recuperated, he recalled the thunder spear that Bo Er had returned to him. The first spear was facing his back so he could not see the details clearly. Later, the 2 spears that were aimed at him and Chao Changqing were facing each other. Su Fengnian imitated the footsteps and jogged a few steps. After dozens of times, he felt that he could not grasp the main point and put it aside for the time being. After all, this was the ultimate skill of a great devil. The difficulty was not in the form, but in the knowledge of the qi mechanism and meridians. If it could be solved so easily, it would be too worthless. Su Fengnian's eyes almost popped out of their sockets at that time. The layman only watched for the excitement while the expert watched for the knack. In the end, it was just a matter of dividing the boundaries. It was no wonder that Wang Xianxia had shamelessly peeped at the fight between the masters and then used the other skills to improve her skills. Su Fengnian held the torn page of the secret manual and muttered to himself. It was hard to imagine that this was a hunting target who was fighting with his life just a moment ago. Su Fengnian held the torn page of the secret manual and muttered to himself. It was hard to imagine that this was a hunting target who was fighting with his life just a moment ago. This was all thanks to the good temperament that he had honed during his travels. Old Huang said that it was a blessing to be able to sleep and wake up. When Hua said that it was even more a blessing to be able to eat and poop. Su Fengnian felt that it was quite reasonable. As for the short reunion and quick parting with her, Su Fengnian did not feel too much melancholy. At this moment he was not qualified to be sentimental. Moreover, Jianghu was no longer the little mud man who only knew how to smash mud or bite people. Since she could ride the sword, there was no reason for him not to try his best to improve his state. The next time they met, this stupid girl would most likely be determined to stab him to death with her sword. Su Fengnian suddenly raised his head and saw a figure full of murderous intent. An old monk standing beside the inferior horse lowered his head and put his palms together. Su Fengnian smiled and forcibly dispersed his murderous intent. The old monk, who was already a Buddha in the human world, raised his head and said, "If His Royal Highness wants to vent his murderous intent, I will not fight back." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "The holy monk already has an invincible Vajra body. It makes no difference whether you fight back or not. Because of a good karma, I almost died on the grassland. Now my whole body is aching, so I won't waste my energy." The old monk said calmly, Your Highness, you don't have to worry about the safety of the shepherd tribe. I will stay here. Su Fengyin asked, Old Abbot, are you speculating what kind of role the future king of Beiliang will play? If it doesn't suit you, do you want me to die in Beimang? You're wrong. Whether it suits me or not, it seems that I was destined to die in Tuoba Chunsen's pursuit. The old monk shook his head and said, It is a person with great luck who has unknowingly changed the fate. It is true that there is no fixed pattern in chess. It is not my intention. Su Fengyin almost blurted out, F***ck your mother, but he managed to hold it back. He took a deep breath and squeezed out an insincere smile and said, Old Abbot, what are you here for? Is there a good karma waiting for me? The old monk laughed involuntarily and shook his head. Your Highness, you are overthinking. I am here to give you a 2 Zen pill as compensation for my miscalculation. Su Fengyin did not hesitate and asked with a smile, Let's not talk about the past. It will hurt our relationship. Old Abbot, other than giving me 3, 4, 5, 6 golden elixirs which are known as living sariras, do you have any Buddhist martial arts secret manuals? The old monk gently withdrew his hand from the sleeve of his kasaya and said with a smile, There is only one elixir and no secret manuals. But looking at your Highness's face, there is no big problem. It seems that you don't need the 2 Zen pills. I will not add flowers to brocade. Su Fengyin stared and trotted to the side of the Buddha. He said with a smile, Don't, old abbot. Come, take it out and let me have a look. The old monk looked embarrassed and put his hand into his sleeve. He said with guilt, That's strange. I think I lost it. Su Fengyin's face stiffened. He gritted his teeth and said, Old abbot, can't you act like a master? The old monk laughed and led the horse away. Chapter 495. When Su Fengyin and the old monk arrived at the herdsman's camp by the lake, they found that the yurts that had just been set up had been pulled out and put back on the carriage. It seemed that they were going to migrate again. The dragon tree monk who was leading the horse slowly turned to Su Fengyin and asked, Your Highness, this is the 4th time you want to kill, why didn't you do anything each time? Su Fengyin laughed and said, Since the old abbot is a holy monk, naturally he is magnanimous and can tolerate people who cannot be tolerated in the world. Didn't they say that Buddha's head is full of dung? Why are you arguing with me? The old monk took a deep look at this vengeful young man and laughed. Your Highness is really a petty person with a lively mind. But whether you want to kill or not is not a matter. I still want to ask your Highness to vent the anger in your heart and part on good terms. Su Fengyin did not hide this time. He put away his frivolous and impetuous expression and said calmly, The killing intent is real, but I dare not have it. I am afraid that the old abbot will treat me as a devil that everyone wants to kill. When I return to the 2 Zen temples, the holy land of Buddhism, I will be nailed to death with just a spit. I have seen the temperament of the Taoist Jinren. Zhao Huangchao and Zhao Xuanzu are not good people, but their realms are extremely high. I really don't know how they cultivated to such realms. The old monk sighed softly. These 2 Taoist Jinren of Dragon Tiger Mountain, in the end they still can't let go of that surname. No wonder they strayed into the unorthodox path. Just like me, I can't keep my original heart these years. How can I resolve it if I don't insist on it? After I became the abbot, I couldn't figure out many things. After thinking about it, I still couldn't figure it out. I went to countless Taoist classics to find out. In the end, I felt that in the 24th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, Tao follows nature, was the most important. Later on, my disciple said that he wanted to see his nature clearly and attain Bodhi by himself. I also felt that it was good. When I argued with my senior brother about the 2 Gathas, my disciple returned from a long journey to the west and only said 8 words, Beautiful is beautiful, but not perfect. My senior brother nodded in agreement and passed away. There was also the saying of the Confucian sages, Don't do evil because it's small, and don't do good because it's small. This trip to Beimang is destined to destroy the so-called Buddha realm in the eyes of the world. Su Fengyin frowned. Drop in level? The old monk smiled and nodded, yes. Su Fengyin shook his head and said, I don't understand the epiphany and Buddhahood mentioned by the white-robed monk. The old monk smiled and said, Old monk doesn't really know how to be tactful. Otherwise, it would be more appropriate for me to speak with your Highness in Buddhist language that people don't fully understand. Su Fengyin said helplessly, Old abbot, you finally have the demeanor of an expert. The old monk, who was leading the horse with one hand and holding the bamboo staff with the other, said softly, Even so, I will not give away the 2 Dhyana pills. Su Fengyin wanted to say something but stopped. The old monk said softly, Why don't you ask yourself instead of Buddha? Su Fengyin smiled bitterly and put back the question about Su Shao that he didn't dare to know the answer to. Su Fengyin then said to himself, no matter what your intentions are, since you are going to drop in level, old abbot's trip can be considered as me going to hell. The high and mighty ones can only be gilded Buddha statues and clay bodhisattvas. Only those like old abbot who are willing to walk among the common people can be considered true monks. The old monk silently reached into the sleeve of his kasaya and took out a small square wooden box. Seeing Su Fengyin's confusion, the abbot of the two Zen temples said seriously, I'm old, so I like to be praised. Su Fengyin silently took the wooden box. The corner of his mouth twitched and he was speechless. When the herdsmen saw Su Fengyin and the old monk coming together, they were pleasantly surprised. They were surprised that the young bodhisattva had returned, which made them feel guilty. They were happy that the Buddha had returned to the world again. For a small tribe that had suffered many disasters, it was a great psychological comfort. Huyen Guanyin and Abaoji jogged to the high and mighty bodhisattva and Buddha. She didn't know why she stopped, but the excited child broke free from her hand and ran over. Su Fengyin changed his clothes, asked for a bag of water and food and continued north. Nanbei, don't you feel that the leaves of your peach tree of the same age are not luxuriant enough? Master, can you not trick me into going to pee and fertilize it? If that thing and mistress find out, I'll be beaten to death. You have the guts to not go to Jinding to quarrel, causing master to travel thousands of miles. If not 10 pounds of saliva, at least 8 pounds. Don't you feel guilty? I'll go and cook later. You don't seem to be smart enough. Master, just tell me what I should do. Mistress said this morning that it's not suitable to wash clothes for the next few days. Understood. Then what are you waiting for? Didn't I say I'll help you massage your back for an hour? It's only been the time it takes to burn a stick of incense. Looks like you're getting smarter. Not bad, not bad. Master. Mistress brought things down the mountain to buy rouge and powder again. A few days ago, Mistress said that there used to be many rich chivalrous men who pursued her. She even said that if she were to marry any of them, she wouldn't even blink when buying a box of rouge that cost dozens of taels of silver. It's not like now. Is that so? Yes. That's good. Master's master is coincidentally not in the temple. He has a few sets of Buddhist scriptures. Go steal them and pawn them for money. Anyway, when you return to the temple, he can bear to hit me, but he can't bear to hit you. Master, this is a violation of the precepts. You've already fallen in love with a girl and vowed not to be a Buddha. Why are you still afraid of this? Master, the weather is good. I'm going to wash clothes. Go, go, go. You're still not smart enough. The little monk ran to Duanmu Basin to get a washboard and sat on a small stool under the sun. Back in Bailiang Palace, she wore half a kilogram of red makeup on her face. His Royal Highness might have been kind and didn't want to hurt her heart, but stupid North-South really thought it looked good at that time. After that, he felt more and more that he wanted to become a Buddha. If he could burn Buddhist relics, she would be able to buy better rouge and powder. However, she had a dream. He couldn't become a Buddha now. Stupid North-South lowered his head and washed his clothes, feeling very worried. On Mount Longhu, which was as famous as the two Zen temples, a withered and thin young man beat down Qi Xuanzhen's black tiger. The fight shook the earth and the mountains, and then he rode the tiger down the mountain. Bailiang Palace, Tide Listening Pavilion. On a cool mountain, there was no wind or rain. Chapter 496. Li Yishan was hunched over a table on the dark and damp top floor, writing about the ups and downs of the power struggles of the past dynasties. He had already written about the current emperor and Jianghu. He shook his wrist and accidentally dripped a few drops of ink onto the paper. Looking at the slowly spreading ink stains, this chief advisor of the king's residence who had lived in the pavilion for 20 years suddenly felt nauseous. He hurriedly covered his mouth, picked up the wine gourd by his feet and swallowed the blood that surged up his throat with a mouthful of green ant wine. After putting down the wine gourd, his vision was blurry. The end of the scroll. Since ancient times, incapable and lazy rulers nurture powerful ministers. In this dynasty, the famous ministers assist the emperor. How strange. The few words were written crookedly and lost its usual style. Li Yishan sighed softly. He put down the hard brush and placed it on the brush holder. He spat out a mouthful of foul air mixed with the smell of wine and blood. Li Yishan casually flipped open a few books about the dynasty's geography that the 5 or 6 servant girls of Wutong Garden had recently compiled together. He put them down after a few glances. He struggled to stand, pushed open the door and walked to the corridor under the eaves. After thinking for a moment, he walked downstairs for the first time. For some reason, the white fox face also followed behind him. They walked to the first floor and out of Tide Listening Pavilion. They came to the lakeside where tens of thousands of precious koi fish were raised. The servants guarding the pavilion were shocked and immediately notified the king of Bailiang. Li Yishan stood at the edge of the pavilion, swaying. He waited until Su Xiao ran over before he sat down with difficulty. Su Xiao sat next to this nation scholar who had been called the right-hand man with Zhao Chongling back then. He put his old fox fur coat on Li Yishan and said with a frown, "Yuanying, your body cannot withstand the cold. Why did you come out of the pavilion?" Li Yishan covered his mouth and still could not stop coughing. Su Xiao hurriedly patted his back gently. The spring and autumn state scholar looked at the lake with a serene gaze and said softly, "Great General, how many years have I been with you?" Su Xiao sighed, "It's been 32 years. Back then I was a barbarian of humble birth. Not many scholars were willing to be my subordinates. They all found it embarrassing and humiliating. Only you and the two rash youths from Chongling came stupidly. Back then I felt that you two either had problems with your heads or had ill intentions. Later I found out that I had picked up a treasure." Li Yishan retracted his hand and put it on his knee. He smiled and said softly, "General, Zhang Julu is a minister with more ambition and talent than me and Zhao Chongling. Is it tiring to have such a court opponent?" Su Xiao gently patted the back of his old partner of more than 30 years and smiled, "What's there to be afraid of with you around? In any case, I've always been the one charging and breaking through enemy lines, while you've always been the strategist. Have you ever been afraid of anyone?" Li Yishan grimaced and said, "You are such a scoundrel." Su Xiao laughed and said, "I'm just a rough person. Other than the shoe sewing that I learned from old Song back then, I can still be considered decent. After tricking a wife back, I can't do any other delicate work." Li Yishan's smile was faint. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the sky. He slowly said, "Back then many people urged you to be the emperor. I was one of the few who did not agree. If back then, because you listened to my nonsense, so many soldiers were bitterly disappointed and decided to retire, and many people became enemies with you. Today you can scold them back." Su Xiao shook his head and said, "It is not a big matter. Also, I know that I do not have the fate of being the emperor. It has nothing to do with you." Li Yishan coughed several times and said, "Zhang Julu is very formidable. In just a few years he has stirred up a new structure and new atmosphere in the imperial court. Although he often violates taboos and provokes criticism, it is indeed a meritorious service to the country. Moreover, there is a wise ruler overseeing the dragon throne, so he has no worries about the future. Especially in the matter of raising the border, his achievements are remarkable, making people exclaim in admiration. Several times the war between the two countries ended in failure, but under his arrangement on the eastern border of the two dynasties, the declining trend was reversed. The collapse of the border defense was gradually mended, and a large number of young and strong generals who were good at fighting were selected to go to the border to resist the enemy. What was hard to come by was persuading Gu Jiantang to add 2 assistant ministers to the Ministry of War to fill the gap in the border defense. At the time, under the old Grand Secretary's hand, they were appointed to the military academy at the border. If they were not turbid, then they were not valued, but now they were in high demand. It was enough to show the foundation of Zhang Julu, the empire's pasting master. He is a great general, but Zhang Julu is not perfect either. This purple-bearded, blue-eyed man is gentle in small matters, but in big matters he is conceited and oppressive. It can be said that if other colleagues disobey him, he will immediately be crushed. This is bound to be the root of a disaster. Presently, although the old aristocratic and powerful families no longer exist, the previous dynasty's meritorious and distinguished officials are taking turns to control the imperial court. Without a foundation, there are still 2 groups of scholars supporting them. And most of the leading figures of these 2 influential families have been forced to resign from their posts, expelled from the cabinet, or bravely retreated at the top of the stream, using the excuse of returning to their hometown to recuperate from their illness. This is why the new Right Chancellor of the Imperial College scolded him for playing the flute, pinching eyes, beating drums and playing the pipa. It's just that he scolded fiercely, but in the end he still did not understand Zhang Julu's intention. This Grand Secretary who monopolizes the power of the state clearly wants to ruin his reputation after one person's death in exchange for eternal peace. Li Yishan suddenly became spirited and his snow-white face began to turn red. He continued, "The blue-eyed man wants to see the Su family defeated in his lifetime. I, Li Yishan, am not good enough, but I am good enough to ruin some things. I have left 16 strategies to deal with it. In addition, I have also written down the 6 treatises on the governance of Bailiang, a total of 34 proposals. I have also finished writing them and left them for Feng Yan. Baihu stood behind the two old men and remained silent. He knew that this withered state scholar was already beyond cure and did not have much time left. Su Xiao said softly, "Don't say any more." Li Yishan loosened his fist, revealing a pool of blood in his palm. He smiled and stopped coughing, but blood seeped out from the corner of his mouth. He closed his eyes in extreme exhaustion and said, "Mr. Nangong, Li Yishan has a favor to ask of you. In the future, if Feng Yin is in trouble and the 300,000 cavalrymen are unable to rescue him, I implore Mr. Nangong to lend a hand." Baihu said in a low voice, "Don't worry, Mr. Nangong. I can't see clearly." Li Yishan, whose vision began to blur, raised his trembling arm and pointed in the air with his fingers. It was as if he had played a game of black and white chess with the young His Royal Highness in those years. There seemed to be some regret on his weathered face. He had been too strict with this child, scolding him too much and praising him too little. This man, who might have died of illness or old age, leaned his head heavily on the general sitting shoulder to shoulder and murmured, "Finally I can have a good sleep." He would sleep and never wake up again. Life and death were both important and insignificant. Baihu turned his head away and could not bear to watch. Su Xiao, the king of Bailiang, only gently helped him gather the fox fur coat that was about to slip off. Chapter 497. After the previous emperor of Beimang ascended the throne, he believed he had done 4 major things. He unified the imperial tent, built more than 600 relay stations, dug wells where there was no water, and set up Red Army guards in all the military towns and cities. The present empress had usurped the throne but did not change politics. Other than continuing to work hard on these 4 matters, she also did 2 other things. She separated the military from the people. She separated the military from the people. She also set up taxes and household registration. She also set up the agriculture department and wrote the essentials of agriculture. The civil official system in Beimang was not as perfect as it was in the spring and autumn period and the Central Plains. The emperor had to spend a great deal of energy on every matter. Therefore, in Su Fengyin's view, wearing the dragon robe was not attractive at all. Every family had their own problems. Emperor Zhao of the Liang dynasty was even more diligent. It was said that in these years he wrote thousands of words a day. It had to be said that this was an emperor who ruled the world, and not a scholar who pursued authorship. To say nothing of other things, just the court meetings where he personally sat at the court door and dealt with all the major and minor matters of the 3 provinces and 6 ministries made the people who thought that an emperor only had 3 palaces and 6 courtyards fearful. It was late spring, the season of the valley rain. The heavy rain poured down on Great Peace City. Previously, the capital did not have the custom of putting up seals of the Taoist master Forbidden Scorpion. However, as Prime Minister Qingxi Zhao Danping gained power in the capital and the people praised it, especially after the example of the emperor, the entire city had the custom of putting up seals of the Forbidden Scorpion in cinnabar. Normal people would go to the Taoist temple and spend a few dozen won to buy the seals. Rich families naturally had ways to get the Taoist spiritual master to personally write the seals. In the big houses, the clever old immortals in the Taoist temples of the capital would send Taoist children to deliver stack after stack of vermilion seals to their doors. This was no different from the warm tea given in the valley rain during the Qingming festival. At this time there was still a short time before dawn. A man wearing a red python robe walked deep inside the palace. He held a few yellow talismans with red pellets that were completely different from the ordinary Forbidden Scorpion talismans. His other hand hung down in his sleeve, carrying an ordinary oil paper umbrella. He slowly walked through the corridors and aisles, heading towards the north gate of the Black Tortoise in the imperial palace. The man had no eyebrows or beard, only a head full of snow-white hair. 2 strands of long hair hung down in front of his bright red robe. The hand that held the talisman in his sleeve seemed to be trimmed and was as fair and slender as a woman's. However, upon closer inspection, there were countless red threads that looked like tiny snakes wriggling in the air. Although it was just a light drizzle, it was probably because they were close to the lake. After the shower, there were sounds of frogs croaking nearby. The north gate of the Black Tortoise had a drum room and a leaky room. There were diligent eunuchs on duty in each room. This eunuch in the python robe, whose hair was as white as frost, but whose face was well maintained and who looked to be middle-aged, walked without a sound, like a red cat that was hunting mice in the night. The number of eunuchs in the imperial palace who were qualified to wear the red python robe could be counted on one's fingers. In terms of official rank, they were led by a 4th-level official who was in charge of the ceremonial seal eunuch and a 4th-level official who was in charge of the ceremonial brush eunuch. The imperial palace of Great City was said to have 100,000 eunuchs. Although this was an exaggeration, it also showed that there were many eunuchs in the Zhao family that ruled the world. This eunuch, whose attire was enough to be called Diao Temple, came to the Black Tortoise Gate and stuck a red seal with a picture of a rooster pecking at a scorpion. He didn't know how to read and naturally couldn't recognize what was written on those exquisite seals. When he entered the imperial palace at a young age, he didn't have the money to enter a school or private school. After entering the imperial palace and following his master, he was so busy that he didn't have the time to study. Later, his master became the emperor. Probably to avoid suspicion, he didn't have the inclination to study. Standing under the gate and looking at the seal personally written by Zhao Danping of Longhu Mountain, this eunuch's lips moved slightly and he said 3 words that no one could hear: Ghost Seal. He raised his head to look at the sky. There was going to be a heavy rain. It was a pity that the newly red peach blossoms and the newly green buds would be ruined. He silently picked up his umbrella and walked back. As the 4th watch approached, an old eunuch on duty hurriedly ran toward the drum room with a green plate with golden characters on it. Along the way, all the eunuchs, regardless of their status, had to stand sideways to show their respect. Even the eunuchs inside the room, whose doors were not closed, had to stand up when they saw the old eunuch. Eunuchs, in the eyes of the world, were shrouded in fog, and there were too many rules and regulations to pay attention to. Once there was a great eunuch with imperial favor who bumped into an eunuch on duty and missed the night shift. That great eunuch's former supervisor had already become the head of the Imperial Horse Directorate. In private they called each other father and son. The eunuch on duty was bitten back and beaten to death. Later, when Han Diaoxi found out, not only was this great eunuch in his prime, but even the head eunuch of the Imperial Horse Directorate was lynched and skinned alive. This was a major matter that even the officials of the imperial court were terrified of. The emperor, who was used to personally attending to matters of state and family, only laughed it off. As for the censor's accusations, which were like snowflakes falling from the sky, he dismissed them with the words, "It's a family matter." At this time, the old eunuch, who was heading toward the drum room to deliver the hour plate, was immersed in the reverence of all the eunuchs he passed. When he saw the big red python robe and white hair turn around the corner, his hair immediately stood on end. He didn't dare to stop. He only bent down and lowered his head. His large strides became small steps, but he increased his pace so that his speed didn't increase. The white-haired, red python eunuch moved his shoulders slightly. The 2 eunuchs, whose statuses were as different as heaven and earth, brushed past each other. The old eunuch didn't even dare to breathe loudly. How could he not be afraid? When the new prince, who had been left behind among the common people, entered the palace, the person behind him had killed more than 400 eunuchs who dared to talk about the prince's identity in private. Among them was the head eunuch of the guard bureau, one of the 24 yamans that he trusted.